The slap echoed like the gunshot through the birthday party, so sharp, so sudden, that the DJ's hands froze on the turntable and Cardi B's voice died mid-verse. Kiara Reed, 21 years old and radiant in a jade silk dress that caught the light like water, stumbled backward into a marble counter. Her cheek burned, her vision blurred. But before she could even process the shock, a hand, thick, calloused, brutal, wrapped around her throat and shoved her against the wall. Officer Nolan Rusk grinned. Not smiled, grinned. The kind of expression that came from years of knowing he was untouchable. "You forgot your place," he slurred, his breath reeking of bourbon. His off-duty badge glinted on his belt like a threat. "I'm the law, sweetheart. Who the hell do you think they'll believe?" Kiara didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked him dead in the eyes, her voice steady despite the hand crushing her windpipe, and said two words that would destroy him. "Everyone's watching." And they were. 30 phones, 30 cameras, 30 witnesses who had just seen a cop assault a woman in a room full of people who thought they were safe. If you want to see how power crumbles when courage meets documentation, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this truth travels. The evening had started like a dream Kiara almost didn't believe she deserved. She stood in front of her dorm mirror that afternoon, smoothing the jade dress over her hips, and thought, just one night. One night where I'm not the scholarship girl, not the activist, not the daughter of someone important, just Kiara. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Be safe tonight, baby. I love you." Kiara smiled, typed back a heart emoji, and didn't mention where she was going. Governor Elise Reed didn't need to know about every college party her daughter attended, especially not this one, especially not when Kiara had spent the last 3 years trying to carve out an identity that wasn't defined by her mother's title, her mother's power, her mother's shadow. Tonight was supposed to be normal. A birthday party at Madison Chen's family estate in the hills. One of those sprawling mansions with too many rooms, a pool lit like a jewel, and a guest list that read like a who's who of privilege. Madison was sweet, if a little oblivious, and she'd invited Kiara with genuine warmth. "You have to come," she'd insisted. "It's not a party without you." So Kiara went. She let her roommate, Tasha, do her makeup. She wore the dress her grandmother had sent her for Christmas, the one that made her feel elegant and grown, and like she was stepping into the life she was building for herself, brick by brick, with no shortcuts. When she arrived at the estate, the party was already in full swing. Music pulsed from hidden speakers. String lights draped the trees like constellations. People danced on the patio, laughed by the pool, filled the house with the kind of careless joy that came from never having to worry about rent, tuition, or whether you'd eat tomorrow. Kiara accepted a mocktail from a passing server. She didn't drink, never had, and let herself relax into the rhythm of the night. She danced with Tasha and a few friends from her sociology class. She posed for photos by the fountain. She laughed so hard her stomach hurt when Madison's little brother tried to beatbox and accidentally spat on the DJ's equipment. For 2 hours, Kiara forgot about deadlines and student loans and the weight of expectations. For 2 hours, she was just a girl at a party. And then Officer Nolan Rusk walked through the door. Kiara didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans, a tight black shirt that strained over his gut, and that badge clipped to his belt like a religious icon. He moved through the crowd with the swagger of a man who believed every room was his by right. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, mid-40s with graying temples and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He grabbed a beer from the cooler, didn't thank the host, and scanned the room like a predator assessing prey. Kiara felt his gaze land on her before she saw him. It was the kind of look that made her skin crawl, slow, deliberate, stripping. She turned away, instinctively moving toward the kitchen where Tasha was refilling a punch bowl. "Girl, who invited him?" Tasha muttered, nodding toward Rusk. "That's Madison's uncle or cousin or something. Cop, total creep. Last year he got drunk and told some girl she was lucky to be here because her family's from Mexico. Madison's mom had to kick him out." Kiara's stomach tightened. "Why is he back?" Tasha shrugged. "Family, I guess. Rich people forgive everything." Kiara wanted to leave. Every instinct told her to grab her purse, hug Madison goodbye, and call an Uber. But she hated that feeling, The way men like Rusk could poison a space just by existing in it. The way their presence could steal joy from people who'd done nothing wrong. So she stayed. She poured herself another mocktail, chatted with a classmate about an upcoming exam, and tried to pretend she didn't feel those eyes still following her across the room. 20 minutes later, Kiara was alone in the kitchen, checking her phone, when Rusk cornered her. He didn't approach like a guest. He approached like he was making an arrest. Purposeful, invasive, blocking the doorway with his body so she couldn't slip past. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning against the counter. His breath reeked of beer and something sharper. Madison really upgraded the guest list. Didn't know this was a charity event. Kiara's jaw tightened. She kept her voice polite, neutral. "Excuse me, I need to get back to my friends." She moved toward the door. Rusk shifted his weight, blocking her path. "Relax, sweetheart. I'm just making conversation." He smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "You go to the university, right? Let me guess. Full ride? Diversity quota?" Kiara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She'd heard variations of this her entire life. The implication that she didn't earn her place, that her existence in certain spaces was an act of charity or affirmative action rather than merit. "I'm a senior," she said evenly. "Double major, 3.9 GPA, and I earned every bit of it." Rusk laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Sure you did. I bet Mommy and Daddy are real proud." Kiara's pulse spiked. He didn't know. He had no idea who her mother was, and she intended to keep it that way. She didn't need her mother's name to defend herself. She never had. "Move," she said, her voice colder now. "Please." Rusk's smile faded. His eyes darkened. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Let me tell you something, princess. Girls like you think you can walk into places like this and act like you belong. But you don't. You're a guest, and guests should know how to behave." Kiara's heart hammered, but she kept her face calm. She'd been trained, by her mother, by experience, by necessity, never to show fear to men who fed on it. "I said move." For a moment, Rusk just stared at her. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, but only enough for her to squeeze past. As she did, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You better watch yourself, girl. You're playing in a world you don't understand." Kiara didn't respond. She walked out of the kitchen, her legs steady even though her hands were shaking, and found Tasha by the pool. "We need to go," she said quietly. Tasha took one look at her face and nodded. "What happened?" "Madison's uncle. Kiara swallowed hard. "He's drunk and aggressive, and I don't want to be here anymore." Tasha linked her arm through Kiara's. "Say no more. Let's bounce." They started toward the front door, weaving through the crowd. Kiara was almost to the foyer, almost safe, when she heard Rusk's voice behind her, loud, mocking, meant to be heard. "There she goes!" The charity case, running home to her rat-hole dorm. Laughter rippled through a small group near the bar. Not everyone laughed. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure, but enough did. Enough that Kiara felt the humiliation burn through her chest like acid. She should have kept walking. She knew she should have. But 3 years of swallowing insults, of smiling through microaggressions, of being told to stay calm and rise above. Something inside her snapped. Kiara turned around. Rusk stood by the kitchen doorway, beer in hand, surrounded by a few guys who looked just like him. Middle-aged, entitled, drunk on power and alcohol. He smirked when he saw her stop. "Got something to say, sweetheart?" Kiara walked back toward him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The music kept playing, but people were starting to notice. Conversations dimmed, eyes turned. "Yeah," Kiara said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I do." She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he couldn't pretend he didn't hear, far enough that he couldn't touch her without making it obvious. "You're a bully," she said. "You're drunk. You're a cop who thinks his badge makes him untouchable. And you're terrified of women like me because deep down, you know you didn't earn your place either. You were just born into it." The room went silent. Rusk's face darkened. The smirk vanished. He set his beer down slowly, deliberately, and took a step toward her. "What did you just say to me?" Kiara didn't flinch. "You heard me." Tasha grabbed her arm. "Kiara, let's go." But Rusk was already moving. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his bulk towering over her, his face twisted with rage. "You little—" That's when he hit her. The slap came so fast, so hard, that Kiara's vision whited out for a second. Pain exploded across her cheek. She stumbled backward, her hip slamming into the edge of a marble counter. Her ears rang, her eyes watered. The room erupted, gasps, shouts, someone screaming, "Oh my God!" But it all sounded distant, muffled, like Kiara was underwater. And then Rusk's hand was around her throat. He shoved her against the wall, his fingers digging into her windpipe, cutting off her air. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he snarled. "You think you're special? You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Kiara clawed at his hand, trying to breathe, but he was too strong. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Panic surged, not just from the lack of air, but from the realization that he might actually kill her, right here, in front of everyone. And then she saw it, the phones. Dozens of them, held high, recording. Witnesses. Evidence. With the last bit of air in her lungs, Kiara choked out 2 words. "Everyone's watching." Rusk followed her gaze. His eyes widened as he saw the cameras, the crowd pressing closer, the horror on their faces. For a split second, doubt flickered across his features, but then his ego swallowed it whole. He released her throat and grabbed her wrist instead, twisting it behind her back hard enough to make her cry out. "Probable cause," he announced loudly, his voice suddenly official, performative. "I have reason to believe this individual is in possession of illegal substances." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "That's bullshit!" Rusk ignored them. He hauled Kiara toward the front door, his grip bruising her arm. She tried to pull away, but he yanked her forward so hard she nearly fell. "You're under arrest," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who believed the system would always protect him. Kiara's mind raced. She knew her rights. She knew the law. And she knew exactly what he was doing, manufacturing a crime to justify the assault, banking on the fact that his badge would make his word gospel. But she also knew something he didn't. She had never been powerless. Not once in her life. She had just chosen not to wield that power. Until now. Outside, the cool night air hit Kiara's face like a slap. Rusk dragged her down the front steps, past the fountain, toward the circular driveway where a dozen cars were parked. People followed, some filming, some shouting, Madison crying and begging her uncle to stop. Rusk pulled out his phone with his free hand and made a call. "This is Officer Nolan Rusk, badge 4728. I need backup at 1547 Hillcrest Drive. Suspect in custody. Black female, early 20s, green dress. Suspected possession with intent to distribute." Kiara's stomach twisted. He was calling it in, making it official, layering lie upon lie until the truth drowned beneath procedure and paperwork. She forced herself to speak, her voice hoarse but steady. "I do not consent to this arrest. I have committed no crime. I am invoking my right to remain silent and my right to legal counsel." Rusk yanked her forward. "Shut up! You assaulted me in front of witnesses. You are attempting an unlawful arrest without probable cause. Every second of this is being recorded." "I said shut up!" Rusk shoved her toward his truck, a massive black pickup parked near the gate. He opened the passenger door and tried to push her inside. Kiara planted her feet. "I have the right to be transported in a marked police vehicle. You cannot transport me in your personal truck. That's kidnapping." Rusk's face went purple. For a moment, Kiara thought he might hit her again, and part of her almost hoped he would, because every escalation was more evidence, more proof, more ammunition for the reckoning she knew was coming. But he didn't hit her. He did something worse. He called for backup again, and this time he lied with surgical precision. Suspect is combative and resisting arrest. Possible substance influence, requesting immediate assistance. Sirens wailed in the distance. 2 police cruisers pulled up within minutes, their lights strobing red and blue across the mansion's facade. 4 officers emerged, 2 men, 2 women, all in uniform, all looking between Rusk and Kiara with varying degrees of confusion. "What's the situation?" one of the male officers asked. Rusk straightened, slipping seamlessly into the role of professional lawman. "Responded to a disturbance. Suspect became aggressive when questioned. I observed erratic behavior consistent with intoxication or drug use. When I attempted to detain her for questioning, she assaulted me. Kiara's jaw dropped. That's a lie. He hit me. He choked me. There are 30 witnesses. She's been verbally combative and physically resistant, Rusk continued, talking over her. I'm placing her under arrest for assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and suspected possession of a controlled substance. One of the female officers frowned, glancing at Kiara's torn dress, the red marks on her throat, the bruise already blooming on her cheek. She doesn't look combative, she looks hurt. Rusk's eyes flashed. Are you questioning my assessment, Officer Delgado? Delgado hesitated, and Kiara saw it, the calculus every cop had to make when challenging a superior, the weighing of conscience against career. No, sir, Delgado said quietly, and Kiara's heart sank. Rusk smiled. Good. Cuff her. The handcuffs were cold and too tight. Kiara felt them bite into her wrists as Officer Delgado secured them behind her back, murmuring a quiet, I'm sorry, that did nothing to stop the machinery of injustice. The crowd had swelled now, easily 50 people, maybe more, all filming, all shouting, Madison sobbing into her mother's shoulder. Someone yelled, "This is wrong!" Someone else threatened to call a lawyer, but the officers formed a wall around Kiara, and the wall was impenetrable. Rusk grabbed her arm again, rougher now, emboldened by the presence of his colleagues. He started marching her toward one of the cruisers. Kiara's mind whirred. She had one card left to play, the nuclear option, the thing she'd sworn she'd never do because she wanted to make it on her own without her mother's name smoothing the path. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival. My mother, Kiara said loudly, her voice cutting through the chaos, is Governor Elise Reed. Rusk stopped walking. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant thrum of the party music still playing inside the house, absurdly cheerful against the nightmare unfolding outside. Then Rusk laughed, a harsh, disbelieving bark. Sure she is, and I'm the president. Her chief of staff's name is Marcus Webb. Her head of security is Denise Ochoa. Her private number is... Kiara rattled off 10 digits without hesitation. Call it, right now. She'll answer. Rusk's laughter died. He looked at the other officers, but they looked just as uncertain. This is a stunt, he said, but his voice wavered. She's lying. Then call the number, Kiara pressed. Prove me wrong. One of the officers pulled out his phone. He dialed, put it on speaker. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a woman's voice, smooth, authoritative, familiar, answered. This is Governor Reed. The world tilted. Rusk's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. The other officers exchanged panicked glances. Officer Delgado's hand flew to her mouth. Mom, Kiara said, her voice cracking for the first time. I need you. There was a pause, one terrible, endless pause, and then the governor's voice turned to ice. Who is this? Why does my daughter sound like she's been crying, and why the hell is she calling from a police officer's phone? Ma'am, this is Officer Delgado, Metro PD. There's been an incident. Put me on video. Now. Delgado fumbled with her phone, switching to FaceTime. The screen filled with Governor Elise Reed's face, a woman in her 50s with Kiara's eyes and cheekbones, sitting at a desk in what looked like her home office, still dressed in a blouse and pearls even at 10 o'clock at night. Her gaze swept the scene, the mansion, the crowd, the police cruisers. And then she saw Kiara, handcuffed, bruised, dress torn, standing in a circle of cops. The governor's expression didn't change. It didn't have to. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Remove the handcuffs, she said quietly. Right now. Officer Delgado scrambled to comply, her hands shaking as she unlocked the cuffs. Kiara's wrists throbbed where the metal had dug in, but she barely noticed. She was watching Rusk, watching the terror creep across his face as he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. Ma'am, I can explain, he started. You will not speak, the governor said, her voice soft and lethal. You will not move. You will stand exactly where you are until I arrive. Officer Delgado, you will ensure that every person at that scene stays put. No one leaves, no one deletes footage. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Good. I'll be there in 12 minutes. The call ended. Silence swallowed the driveway. And then Kiara, exhausted, terrified, furious, looked at Rusk and smiled. You wanted to know who they'd believe, she said softly. I guess you're about to find out. 11 minutes later, the motorcade arrived. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. 3 black SUVs, 2 state patrol cruisers, an ambulance, and a sedan carrying what looked like a small army of lawyers and staffers descended on the mansion like a military operation. Neighbors came out onto their lawns. The party guests poured outside. Everyone stared as the convoy pulled into the circular driveway, engines rumbling, headlights blazing. The middle SUV's door opened, and Governor Elise Reed stepped out. She was 5'6" in heels, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, and she moved with the kind of authority that made grown men step aside without being asked. Her security detail flanked her, stone-faced professionals who looked like they ate nails for breakfast, and her chief of staff trailed behind with a tablet and a phone, already barking orders. But the governor didn't look at any of them. She looked at her daughter. Kiara stood by the fountain, wrapped in someone's jacket, her face bruised and her eyes red from crying. When she saw her mother, something inside her broke. All the strength she'd summoned, all the composure she'd clung to, crumbled like a dam giving way. Mom, she whispered. Elise Reed crossed the driveway in 6 strides and wrapped her arms around her daughter like she could shield her from the entire world. I've got you, she murmured, her voice breaking in a way it never did in public. I've got you, baby. You're safe now. Kiara buried her face in her mother's shoulder and let herself shake, let herself be scared, let herself be 21 years old and hurt and held. And then, just as quickly, the governor pulled back. She cupped Kiara's face in her hands, examining the bruises with a clinical precision that made Kiara's breath catch. Who did this to you? Kiara pointed. Officer Nolan Rusk stood exactly where he'd been told to stand, flanked by his colleagues, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. He'd tried to leave twice in the 11 minutes they'd waited, once toward his truck, once toward the street, but Officer Delgado had blocked him both times, her hand resting pointedly on her sidearm. Now, as the governor turned toward him, Rusk seemed to shrink. All that swagger, all that arrogance, all that certainty that the system would protect him, it evaporated under Elise Reed's gaze like dew under a blowtorch. She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking on the stone driveway. Her security team shadowed her, but she didn't need them. The power radiating off her was weapon enough. She stopped 3 feet away and studied him like a specimen under glass. Your name, she said. Not a question, a command. Rusk swallowed hard. Officer Nolan Rusk, ma'am. Badge 4728. Metro PD, 15 years. I didn't ask for your resume. I asked for your name. Nolan Rusk. The governor nodded slowly. Then she turned to her chief of staff, who was already scrolling through his tablet. Marcus, pull his personnel file. Every complaint, every incident report, every reprimand. I want his full record on my desk in 20 minutes. Already pulled, Governor. Marcus handed her the tablet. 17 complaints in 12 years, 8 allegations of excessive force, 3 accusations of racial profiling, 2 sexual harassment claims, all buried in departmental review. Elise's jaw tightened. She looked back at Rusk. You have a pattern, Officer Rusk. A long, ugly pattern of brutalizing people you thought were powerless, people who couldn't fight back, people the system ignored. Ma'am, You assaulted my daughter, she continued, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet. You struck her in the face. You choked her. You attempted an unlawful arrest based on fabricated charges. You did all of this in front of witnesses because you believed, as you always have, that your badge made you untouchable. Rusk opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't know she was... You didn't know she was my daughter, Elise finished. And that, Officer Rusk, is exactly the problem. You didn't do this because of who she is. You did it because you thought she was nobody. You thought she was powerless. You thought no one would care. She stepped closer, and Rusk actually flinched. But here's the thing you never understood. My daughter has never been powerless. Not because of me, because of who she is. She's brilliant. She's brave. She's stronger than you'll ever be. And she just documented your entire crime with 30 witnesses and a dozen cameras. Elise turned to the officer standing nearby. Officer Delgado, place Officer Rusk under arrest. Charges are assault, battery, attempted kidnapping, falsifying a police report, and abuse of authority. Delgado blinked. Ma'am, I don't have the authority to arrest a fellow officer without— You do now, the governor said flatly. I'm invoking state oversight. This is now a civil rights investigation. If you refuse, I will have the state attorney general do it himself, and you can explain to him why you chose to protect a dirty cop instead of upholding the law. Delgado paled. Then, slowly, she nodded and pulled out her handcuffs. Officer Nolan Rusk, you are under arrest. Watching Rusk get cuffed was surreal. He didn't resist, didn't dare, but his face cycled through a dozen emotions in the span of seconds: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally, pathetically, terror. Please, he whispered as Delgado read him his rights. Please, I made a mistake. I didn't mean— I was drunk. I wasn't thinking— You knew exactly what you were doing, Kiara said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady now, laced with steel. You do this to people all the time. You hurt them because you think you can, because the system lets you. Rusk looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, something like shame flickered in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by desperation. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded sincere. Almost. I'm so sorry. I swear to God I'll never— Save it for your trial, Elise said coldly. She gestured to Delgado. Take him away. As Delgado and another officer led Rusk toward a patrol car, something strange happened. The crowd, the partygoers, the neighbors, the people who'd been filming, started to applaud. It began as a slow clap, tentative and uncertain, and then grew into a roar. People cheered. Someone shouted, "About time!" Madison sobbed with relief, hugging her mother. And Kiara, standing beside her own mother in the flashing lights of a dozen police cars, felt something shift inside her. Not victory, not yet, but the first stirrings of it. The first taste of justice served hot and public and undeniable. But the night wasn't over. As the patrol car carrying Rusk pulled away, Elise turned to her security detail. I want statements from every single person at this party. I want every video, every photo, every scrap of evidence. And I want the name of every officer who's ever worked with Rusk, everyone who covered for him, everyone who knew and did nothing. Marcus nodded grimly. I'll coordinate with the AG's office. This is going to be big, Governor. It's going to get messy. Good, Elise said. It should be messy because this isn't just about tonight. This is about every person Rusk ever brutalized who didn't have a governor for a mother. This is about changing the system that protected him. She looked at Kiara. Are you okay with that? This story is going to be everywhere by morning. Your name, your face, everything. Kiara took a shaky breath. She thought about all the years she'd spent trying to be anonymous, trying to build a life separate from her mother's legacy. She thought about the girl in the green dress who just wanted one normal night. And then she thought about the look in Rusk's eyes when he'd choked her, the certainty that he would get away with it, the arrogance born from a lifetime of getting away with it. I'm okay with it, she said. If it means no one else has to go through this, if it means we can stop people like him, then yeah, I'm okay with it. Elise smiled, a small, fierce, proud smile, and squeezed her daughter's hand. Then let's burn it all down. By midnight, the mansion had been transformed into a makeshift command center. The paramedics examined Kiara, documenting every bruise, every abrasion, every mark Rusk had left, while Elise's legal team interviewed witnesses and collected footage. Madison's mother, horrified and apologetic, offered the family's full cooperation. I never should have invited him, she said, tears streaming down her face. I knew he had problems, but I thought, family, you know? I thought we could manage him. I'm so sorry. You're not responsible for his actions, Elise said, but her tone was firm. But you are responsible for enabling him by keeping him in your circle. That ends tonight. Madison's mother nodded, chastened. Kiara sat on the edge of the fountain, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, watching the controlled chaos unfold around her. Tasha sat beside her, holding her hand, not saying anything, because what was there to say? A young woman approached hesitantly. She was maybe 19 with dark hair and nervous eyes. "Excuse me? Are you Kiara Reed?" Kiara nodded, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "He did the same thing to me. Officer Rusk. 2 years ago. I was at a traffic stop and he said I was resisting, but I wasn't. He slammed me against my car, broke my wrist. When I filed a complaint, they said there wasn't enough evidence." Kiara's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry." "No, The woman wiped her eyes. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him, for not letting him get away with it. Maybe now someone will finally believe us." Kiara stood and hugged her, this stranger who carried the same scars. "They will," she promised. "We're going to make sure of it." And in that moment, surrounded by witnesses and evidence and the machinery of justice finally grinding into motion, Kiara understood something her mother had tried to teach her for years. Power wasn't about titles or badges or who you were born to. It was about choosing not to be silent. It was about refusing to let cruelty hide in the dark. It was about being willing to fight, not just for yourself, but for everyone who came after. The story broke at dawn. Kiara woke up in her childhood bedroom. Her mother had insisted she stay at the governor's residence rather than going back to her dorm, and saw her face on the news. Governor's daughter assaulted by off-duty officer at party, cop arrested on multiple charges. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from friends, classmates, people she hadn't spoken to in years. Most were supportive, some were awful, blaming her, questioning her story, calling her privileged. She turned the phone off and went downstairs. Elise was already in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and reading briefing documents. She looked up when Kiara entered, her expression softening. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, like I got hit by a truck." Kiara poured herself coffee and sat across from her mother. "It's everywhere, isn't it?" "Yes, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." Elise set down her papers. "The police union is already issuing statements. They're claiming Rusk was defending himself, that he had probable cause, that this is a politically motivated attack." Kiara laughed bitterly. "Of course they are. But we have the videos, we have the witnesses, and we have 8 other victims who've come forward since last night, willing to testify." Elise reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "This is going to be a war, baby. A long, ugly war. But we're going to win it." Kiara looked at her mother. This woman who'd fought her whole career for justice, who'd never backed down, who'd taught her daughter that silence was complicity. "What do you need me to do?" Elise smiled. "Rest, heal, and when you're ready, tell your story. Not because you have to, but because your voice matters. Because every person who's ever been brutalized by someone with a badge needs to hear that they're not alone." Kiara nodded. "Okay, but on one condition. Name it." "We don't just go after Rusk. We go after the system that protected him. Every complaint that was buried, every supervisor who looked the other way, every cop who knew and did nothing. We burn it all down." Elise's smile widened. "That's my girl." The war began before breakfast. By 7 a.m., the police union had already held a press conference. Their president, a barrel-chested man named Frank Kowalski with 30 years on the force and a face made for intimidation, stood before a wall of microphones and cameras, his expression grave, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. "Officer Nolan Rusk is a decorated veteran with 15 years of exemplary service," Kowalski intoned, reading from a prepared statement. "Last night he responded to a volatile situation at a private residence where illegal substances were suspected. In the course of performing his sworn duty, he was verbally and physically threatened by an individual who has now weaponized her family connections to destroy a good cop's career." Kiara watched the press conference from her mother's study, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Each word felt like a punch, not because they hurt, but because they were so predictable, so calculated, so perfectly designed to shift blame from predator to prey. "This is a political witch hunt orchestrated by Governor Reed," Kowalski continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. She's using her daughter's regrettable encounter to wage war on law enforcement. She's sending a message that if you wear a badge in this state, you're guilty until proven innocent. Elise stood beside Kiara, her face unreadable. Marcus was on his phone in the corner, speaking in rapid, clipped tones. Denise Ochoa, the head of security, watched the screen with the cold assessment of someone cataloging threats. When Kowalski finished his statement, without taking questions, of course, the news anchors immediately began their analysis. Some were outraged on Kiara's behalf. Others questioned whether the governor was overstepping her authority. One conservative pundit suggested Kiara had provoked Rusk by not showing proper respect. Kiara set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. "They're going to make me the villain, aren't they?" "They're going to try," Elise said quietly. "That's what they always do. They can't defend Rusk's actions, so they'll attack your character. They'll dig into your past, twist your words, find every photo, every mistake, every moment of imperfection, and weaponize it." "Great," Kiara laughed without humor. "So what do we do?" Elise turned away from the screen and looked at her daughter with the full force of her attention. "We tell the truth, loudly, repeatedly, with evidence, and we don't let them control the narrative." Marcus hung up his phone. "The Attorney General wants to meet this afternoon. He's opening a formal investigation, not just into Rusk, but into the entire pattern of complaints against him and why they were systematically dismissed." "Good," Elise said. "What about the other victims?" 8 confirmed so far, possibly more coming forward. My team is coordinating with them, offering legal support, counseling, protection if needed. Marcus glanced at Kiara. "One of them specifically asked to meet you, if you're up for it." Kiara straightened. "Who?" "Her name is Vanessa Torres. She's 23. Rusk pulled her over 3 years ago for a broken taillight. According to her statement, he claimed she was under the influence, pulled her out of the car, and slammed her face first onto the hood when she asked to see a warrant. She filed a complaint the next day. It was dismissed as unsubstantiated within a week." Kiara's stomach twisted. "I want to meet her." "Kiara," Elise started, her voice edged with concern. "You don't have to carry this alone. You don't have to be the face of—" "Yes, I do," Kiara interrupted gently. "Because if I don't, if I hide behind you and let your office handle everything, then Kowalski wins. He gets to paint me as some spoiled governor's daughter who cried to mommy when things got tough. But if I step up, if I stand with the other survivors, then they can't dismiss us. They have to deal with all of us." Elise studied her daughter for a long moment, and Kiara saw something flicker in her mother's eyes. Pride, yes, but also fear. The kind of fear that came from knowing your child was about to walk into a firestorm and there was nothing you could do to protect them from the heat. "Okay," Elise said finally, "but we do this right. You don't face the press alone. You don't make statements without legal review. And the second it becomes too much, the second you need to step back, you do. No shame in that. Understood?" Kiara nodded. "Understood." Marcus made a note on his tablet. "I'll arrange the meeting with Vanessa for this afternoon. Private location, no media. Just you, her, and a counselor if she wants one." "Thank you," Kiara said. Then she turned back to the television, where the pundits were still dissecting her life, and added quietly, "Let them talk. We have the truth." Denise, who'd been silent until now, smiled faintly. "Truth doesn't always win, kid, but it's a hell of a weapon when you know how to use it." The meeting with Vanessa Torres took place at a small legal aid office on the east side of the city, far from the cameras and the noise. Kiara arrived with Marcus and one of her mother's senior staffers, a sharp-eyed woman named Jolene who specialized in victim advocacy. Vanessa was already there, sitting in a plain conference room with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She was petite, maybe 5'2", with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that held too much weight for someone so young. When Kiara entered, Vanessa stood abruptly, her hands twisting together. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I know you probably have a million things to do. I shouldn't have asked to meet. I just—" "Hey," Kiara said softly, crossing the room. "Don't apologize. I wanted to meet you." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "I saw the videos. What he did to you. And I kept thinking, if I'd fought harder 3 years ago, if I'd pushed when they dismissed my complaint, maybe he wouldn't have, Stop. Kiara reached out and gently took Vanessa's hands. This isn't your fault. None of it. Rusk is responsible for Rusk. The system that protected him is responsible, but not you. Never you. Vanessa nodded shakily and sat back down. Kiara sat across from her, and for a few moments they just looked at each other. Two young women connected by violence they hadn't asked for, hadn't earned, hadn't deserved. Can you tell me what happened? Kiara asked. Only if you want to. No pressure. Vanessa took a shaky breath. It was November. I was driving home from my shift at the diner where I work. My taillight was out. I didn't even know until he pulled me over. He came up to my window, shined his flashlight in my face, and the first thing he said was, "You've been drinking." Kiara's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, letting Vanessa speak. I said no because I hadn't. I don't drink. I'm 2 years sober. But he made me get out of the car anyway. Made me do a field sobriety test right there on the side of the highway. I passed, obviously, but he said I was acting suspicious. He said he had probable cause to search my car. Did you consent? Jolene asked from her seat by the door. Vanessa shook her head. I asked to see a warrant. That's what my sponsor always told me. Know your rights, protect yourself. So I asked, and that's when he grabbed me. Her voice cracked. Kiara squeezed her hands. He yanked me forward and slammed me onto the hood of my car. My face hit the metal so hard I thought my nose was broken. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And he was yelling, calling me a junkie, saying I was resisting, saying I was reaching for something, but I wasn't. I swear to God I wasn't. I believe you, Kiara said fiercely. I absolutely believe you. Vanessa wiped her eyes. He cuffed me, put me in his car, and drove me to the station. They searched me, strip searched me, and found nothing. Of course they found nothing. I was clean, but by then he'd already written his report. Said I was combative, said I'd tried to flee, said he'd smelled alcohol on my breath. And when you filed a complaint? Marcus prompted gently. Vanessa laughed bitterly. Internal Affairs called me once, asked a few questions. Then I got a letter 2 weeks later saying the investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. They said it was my word against his, and Officer Rusk had an exemplary record. Kiara felt rage burning in her chest, clean, focused, useful rage. That's going to change, she said. All of it. The AG is opening a full investigation. They're going to reopen every case, every complaint, every buried report, and this time people are going to listen. Vanessa looked at her with something between hope and disbelief. You really think so? I know so, Kiara said, because we're not alone anymore. There are 8 of you, 8 that we know of, probably more, and every single one of you has a story the system tried to silence. But together we're loud enough to break through. Vanessa nodded slowly, and for the first time since Kiara had entered the room, she saw something other than fear in the young woman's eyes. She saw determination. What do you need me to do? Vanessa asked. Kiara glanced at Marcus, who pulled out a folder. We need you to give a formal statement to the Attorney General's office. We need you to be willing to testify if this goes to trial, and it will. And we need you to be prepared for the fact that the defense is going to try to tear you apart. They're going to dig into your past, your sobriety, everything. It won't be easy. I don't care, Vanessa said, her voice steady now. I've been torn apart before. I survived it. And if telling my story means Russ can't do this to anyone else, then it's worth it. Kiara smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since the party. Then let's make sure he never wears a badge again. By the time Kiara returned to the governor's residence that evening, the case had exploded across every major news network. The videos from the party had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, endless commentary. Some of it was supportive. Much of it was vicious. The hashtag #JusticeForKiara was trending alongside #BackTheBlue and #Rusk is innocent. Twitter was a war zone. Reddit threads dissected every frame of the videos, debating whether Kiara had provoked the assault, whether Rusk's actions were justified, whether the governor was abusing her power. Kiara scrolled through her phone, reading comment after comment, until Tasha physically took the device out of her hands. Stop torturing yourself, Tasha said firmly. They were sitting in Kiara's childhood bedroom. Tasha had insisted on staying over, refusing to let her best friend be alone. Those people don't know you. They don't know what happened. They're just trolls with Wi-Fi. Some of them are right, though, Kiara said quietly. I am lucky. If my mom wasn't the governor, Rusk would have gotten away with it. I'd be in jail right now, or worse. That's not luck, Tasha countered. That's injustice. The fact that you need to be powerful to get justice doesn't mean you don't deserve it. It means the system is broken. Kiara leaned back against the headboard and closed her eyes. I keep thinking about Vanessa and all the others. How many people did Rusk hurt? How many complaints were filed and ignored? How many lives did he ruin because no one stopped him? A lot, Tasha said bluntly. And that's exactly why you're doing the right thing. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of them. A soft knock interrupted them. Elise opened the door, still in her work clothes, even though it was nearly 9 p.m. There's someone here to see you, Kiara. She says she's another victim. Her name is Amara Johnson. Kiara sat up. Now? It's late. She insisted, Elise said gently. She drove 2 hours to get here, said she couldn't wait another day. Kiara exchanged a glance with Tasha, then nodded. Okay, let her in. Amara Johnson was older than Vanessa, mid-30s maybe, with short natural hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from carrying too much for too long. She walked into Kiara's room like she was stepping onto a battlefield, her shoulders squared, her chin up. I'm sorry to barge in like this, Amara said, her voice low and controlled. But I saw your face on the news, and I had to tell someone. I had to tell you. Sit, Kiara said, gesturing to the chair by the window. Please, tell me what happened. Amara sat but didn't relax. 5 years ago, I was an EMT. I responded to a domestic violence call. Woman beaten by her husband, needed immediate transport. When we got there, Officer Rusk was already on scene. He'd arrested the husband, but he was aggressive, rough. The husband was drunk, sure, but he was also compliant, cuffed. No threat. She paused, her jaw working. Rusk slammed him into the ambulance anyway, hard enough that the guy hit his head on the bumper and started bleeding. I told Rusk to back off, that we needed to treat him. Rusk told me to shut up and do my job. Kiara's stomach sank. What did you do? I reported it, Amar said. Filed a formal complaint with both the police department and my supervisor. Documented the injuries, the excessive force, everything. And you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except 2 weeks later, I got a call from my boss saying I was being reassigned. No explanation. Just reassigned to a different district, different shift, different partner. They punished you for speaking up, Tasha said, horrified. They isolated me, Amara corrected. Made sure I knew what happened to people who challenged cops like Rusk. Within 6 months, I quit. Couldn't take the retaliation, the whispers, the way my colleagues treated me like I'd betrayed the Brotherhood, even though I wasn't even a cop. She looked at Kiara, and there was steel in her gaze. I saw what he did to you. And I saw that for the first time in 5 years, someone actually arrested him. Someone actually held him accountable. So I'm here to say I'll testify. I'll give a statement. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he never hurts anyone again. Kiara stood and crossed the room. She held out her hand. Thank you. Seriously. Thank you. Amara shook her hand and then, unexpectedly, pulled Kiara into a fierce hug. No, she whispered. Thank you for not letting him win. By the end of the week, 12 victims had come forward. 12 people whose lives had been upended by Officer Nolan Rusk. People of different ages, different backgrounds, different circumstances, united only by the violence they'd survived and the system that had failed them. The Attorney General, a stern man named David Lim, held a press conference announcing the formal investigation. He stood at a podium flanked by his senior prosecutors, his expression grave, his tone uncompromising. Over the past 15 years, Officer Nolan Rusk has been the subject of 17 formal complaints alleging excessive force, racial profiling, false arrest, and abuse of authority. Every single one of those complaints was dismissed by internal review processes that prioritized protecting the department's reputation over protecting the public. Lim paused, letting the words sink in. That ends today. My office, in coordination with Governor Reed and the State Oversight Commission, is launching a comprehensive investigation into Officer Rusk's conduct and the systemic failures that allowed it to continue unchecked. We will review every case, Interview every victim and hold accountable not just Officer Rusk, but every supervisor, every administrator, every official who looked the other way. The press erupted with questions. Lim answered a few. Yes, criminal charges were likely. No, he couldn't comment on specific evidence. Yes, this investigation would extend to the department's culture as a whole. Kiara watched the press conference from her mother's office, surrounded by Marcus, Jolene, and several other staffers who'd become her de facto support team. When Lim finished, Elise muted the television and turned to her daughter. "How are you holding up?" Kiara considered the question. Her face still hurt. She hadn't slept more than a few hours a night since the party. Her phone was a minefield of threats and support in equal measure. But when she thought about Vanessa and Amara and all the others who'd found the courage to speak up, "I'm okay," she said honestly. "Tired, angry, but okay." "Good," Elise said, "because it's going to get harder before it gets easier." Rusk's lawyer just filed a motion to dismiss all charges. They're claiming prosecutorial overreach and political bias. Kiara's eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding." "I wish I were." Marcus pulled up the motion on his tablet. His attorney is arguing that the arrest was unlawful because it was ordered by the governor rather than initiated by standard police procedure. He's trying to frame this as a constitutional crisis. "That's insane," Kiara said. "My mom invoked state oversight authority, which she's legally allowed to do in cases of civil rights violations. This isn't overreach. It's her job." "Legally, you're right," Jolene said. "But optics-wise, they're playing to a certain audience. The government overreach narrative resonates with people who already distrust authority. They're trying to turn Rusk into a martyr." Kiara laughed harshly. "A martyr? The man who choked me in front of 30 witnesses is a martyr." "To some people, yes," Elise said quietly. "That's the world we live in, baby. Justice isn't always about truth. It's about who tells the most convincing story." "Then we need to tell a better one," Kiara said. "What if I do an interview, sit down with a journalist, tell my side, bring in some of the other victims, make it impossible to ignore?" Elise frowned. "That's risky. The defense will use anything you say against you, and once it's out there, you can't take it back." "I don't want to take it back," Kiara said firmly. "I want people to hear what actually happened, not Kowalski's version, not the pundit's speculation, the truth, from me and from the people Rusk victimized." Marcus and Elise exchanged a look, one of those silent parental conversations that said 1,000 things in a glance. Finally, Elise nodded. "Okay, but we do it carefully. We choose the right journalist, someone with integrity, someone who won't sensationalize. And we prep you thoroughly, no surprises." "Deal," Kiara said. Then, after a pause, she added, "I want Vanessa and Amara there too. This isn't just my story, it's ours." The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday with a veteran journalist named Catherine Hayes, a woman with 2 decades of experience covering civil rights cases and a reputation for fairness even when her reporting made powerful people uncomfortable. The taping took place in a neutral studio downtown, not affiliated with any major network, to avoid accusations of bias. Kiara arrived early, her stomach a knot of nerves, and found Vanessa and Amara already there, looking just as anxious. "Hey," Kiara said, sitting between them on the couch, set up for the interview. "You two ready for this?" "No," Vanessa admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." "Same," Amara said. "I've been running from this for 5 years. Time to stand still." Catherine Hayes entered shortly after, a woman in her 50s with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a calm demeanor that immediately put Kiara at ease. She shook each of their hands, explained the format. She'd ask questions, they'd answer honestly, no gotchas or tricks. And then they began. The first half of the interview focused on Kiara. What happened at the party, how she felt during the assault, what she wanted people to understand. Kiara spoke carefully but passionately, her voice steady even when describing the worst moments. "People keep asking why I didn't just leave earlier," Kiara said at one point. "Why I confronted him. And the answer is, because I shouldn't have to run from men who abuse their power. None of us should. We shouldn't have to shrink ourselves or stay silent or disappear just to stay safe. That's not justice. That's survival. And I'm tired of just surviving." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. You've been criticized by some for using your mother's position to get justice. How do you respond to that? Kiara took a breath. I'm not going to apologize for having a mother who loves me enough to fight for me, but I also recognize that I'm lucky. Most people who are brutalized by police don't have a governor on speed dial. Most people file complaints that get buried, or they're too scared to come forward at all because they know the system won't protect them. That's exactly why this can't just be about me. It has to be about changing the system so that everyone, not just the governor's daughter, gets justice. Then Catherine turned to Vanessa and Amara, and their stories poured out, raw, painful, undeniable. Vanessa described the strip search, the humiliation, the way Rusk's lie had followed her for years. Amara talked about losing her career, her passion for helping people, because she dared to call out excessive force. By the end, all three women were in tears. But they were strong tears, the kind that came from speaking truth that had been locked away too long. Catherine turned to the camera. These are just 3 of at least 12 confirmed victims of Officer Nolan Rusk. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether these women are telling the truth. The evidence overwhelmingly supports them. The question is, how many more officers like Rusk are still on the streets, protected by a system that values loyalty over accountability? The interview aired 2 days later and immediately went viral. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded, again, but this time the tide had shifted. People who'd been skeptical started sharing the video with captions like, "Everyone needs to watch this," and "I was wrong about her." Celebrities amplified it. Activists cited it as proof of systemic failure. Even some conservative commentators admitted, grudgingly, that Rusk's actions were indefensible. But the backlash came too. Death threats flooded Kiara's inbox. Someone doxed her dorm address. Protesters showed up outside the governor's residence, some supporting Kiara, others accusing her of waging a war on police. Denise Ochoa upgraded security, assigning a detail to follow Kiara whenever she left the residence. Kiara hated it, hated the loss of freedom, the constant awareness of being watched, but she understood it was necessary. And through it all, the investigation marched forward. More victims came forward, not just people Rusk had hurt directly, but people who'd been targeted by his colleagues, people who'd filed complaints against other officers, only to face the same bureaucratic burial. The AG's office was inundated. What had started as an investigation into one cop had become an indictment of an entire culture. Kiara spent her days meeting with victims, coordinating with lawyers, attending strategy sessions with her mother's team. She barely went to class. Her professors granted her extensions, understanding that what she was doing mattered more than any exam. Tasha brought her meals and forced her to sleep. Marcus kept her informed of legal developments. Elise checked in constantly, balancing her duties as governor with her instinct to protect her daughter. And slowly, piece by piece, they built a case so airtight that even Rusk's high-priced defense team couldn't dismantle it. 3 weeks after the party, Officer Nolan Rusk appeared in court for his arraignment. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, curious onlookers, and an entire row of his victims sitting together in silent solidarity. Kiara sat in the front row beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm. Vanessa sat on her other side, gripping her hand. Amara was right behind them, along with 8 other women and men whose lives Rusk had damaged. When Rusk entered in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his face haggard, a collective shiver ran through the room. He looked small now, diminished. The swagger was gone. The arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. His attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, entered a plea of not guilty to all charges: assault, battery, false arrest, abuse of authority, falsifying police reports. The judge, a stern woman named Angela Reyes, set bail at $500,000, which Rusk's family somehow posted. As he was led out of the courtroom, Rusk's eyes swept the gallery and landed on Kiara. For a moment, they just looked at each other, victim and predator, survivor and abuser, the collision of 2 lives that should never have intersected. Kiara didn't look away. She held his gaze, unflinching, until he was the one who broke eye contact and stumbled forward, his lawyer pulling him toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Hayes was waiting with a camera crew. "Kiara, how do you feel after seeing Officer Rusk arraigned?" Kiara paused, considering her words carefully. I feel like we're one step closer to justice. But arraignment isn't conviction. A trial isn't transformation. We have a long way to go, not just to hold Rusk accountable, but to ensure this never happens again. What would that look like? Catherine pressed. Transparency, Chiara said. Chiara Barpiet. Independent oversight of police complaints, mandatory public reporting of excessive force incidents, an end to qualified immunity for officers who abuse their power, and real consequences, not just for the individual cops who commit violence, but for the systems that enable it. She glanced at the women standing beside her, Vanessa, Amara, and the others, and added, "We're not just asking for one officer to be punished. We're demanding that the entire system change, and we're not going to stop until it does." The cameras flashed. The reporters shouted follow-up questions. But Chiara was already walking away, surrounded by survivors who'd become her allies, her friends, her army. And behind them, the wheels of justice, slow, imperfect, but finally turning, ground forward into the reckoning they'd all been fighting for. The change didn't come like thunder. It came like rain, steady, persistent, wearing down stone until cracks appeared where there had been none before. In the weeks following Rusk's arraignment, Chiara watched as the case she'd helped build began to reshape the landscape around her. The Attorney General's investigation had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations, pulling thread after thread until the entire tapestry of corruption began to unravel. What started as one officer's brutality became a window into decades of systemic failure, complaints buried, victims silenced, officers protected by a code of silence so pervasive it felt unbreakable. Until now. Chiara stood in the state capitol building on a cold Thursday morning in early December, watching through a glass partition as the Legislative Oversight Committee convened for emergency hearings. The gallery was packed with journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who'd taken the day off work to witness history. Her mother sat at the center of a long table facing the committee, 5 senators and 3 representatives, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to hostile. "Governor Reed," began Senator Patricia Hoffman, a silver-haired woman who'd spent 30 years in public service and had the scars to prove it. "Thank you for appearing today. I think we all recognize the gravity of what's been uncovered regarding Officer Rusk and the Metro Police Department's handling of complaints against him." Elise nodded once, her posture perfect, her voice steady. "Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the committee taking this matter seriously. However," Hoffman continued, her tone sharpening, "there are concerns that your personal involvement in your daughter's case, while understandable as a mother, may have compromised the integrity of the investigation. Can you address those concerns?" Chiara watched her mother's face remain impassive, but she knew Elise well enough to see the flash of anger in her eyes, quickly controlled. "Senator, I invoked my legal authority under state oversight statutes to intervene in a civil rights violation," Elise said carefully. "That authority exists precisely for cases where local law enforcement has demonstrated a pattern of failing to police itself. The fact that my daughter was the victim doesn't negate the legitimacy of that intervention. It simply made visible what has been happening to countless others who didn't have a platform to demand justice." "But you didn't just invoke oversight," interrupted Representative Marcus Chen, a younger legislator known for his pro-police stance. "You personally ordered Officer Rusk's arrest at the scene. You deployed state resources, security teams, legal staff, media coordination, all for what amounts to a family dispute." The words hung in the air like poison. Chiara felt her hands curl into fists against the glass. Tasha, standing beside her, muttered a curse under her breath. Elise leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every hour she'd spent building her career, every fight she'd won, every compromise she'd refused to make. "Representative Chen, with all due respect, when a police officer assaults a citizen in front of 30 witnesses, manufactures false charges, and attempts an illegal arrest, that is not a family dispute. That is a crime. And when that same officer has 17 prior complaints of similar behavior that were systematically buried by his department, that is not an isolated incident. That is a pattern of violence enabled by institutional failure." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "If you're suggesting that I should have turned away from my daughter's assault, because holding the perpetrator accountable might look politically motivated, then you're asking me to choose between my duty as a mother and my duty as governor. And I'm here to tell you that those duties aligned perfectly in this case, because protecting my daughter meant protecting everyone. The gallery erupted in applause. Senator Hoffman banged her gavel, calling for order, but Kiara saw several committee members nodding in agreement. Even Chen looked chastened, though he quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "Let's move on," Hoffman said. "Attorney General Lim has submitted a preliminary report to this committee detailing the scope of his investigation. The findings are, frankly, disturbing." She gestured to David Lim, who sat at an adjacent table surrounded by thick binders and laptops. He stood adjusting his glasses and began to speak with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent months buried in evidence. "Over the past 6 weeks, my office has reviewed approximately 400 complaints filed against Metro PD officers over the last 15 years. Of those, 372 were dismissed by internal review as unsubstantiated or unfounded. Of the remaining 28 that resulted in any disciplinary action, only 3 led to termination, and 2 of those were later overturned by the police union and the officers reinstated." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Lim continued, his voice growing harder. "We've also discovered that internal affairs routinely coached officers on how to write reports that would justify use of force after the fact. We found email chains discussing strategies to discredit complainants based on their criminal history, immigration status, or mental health records. In several cases, complainants were themselves arrested on fabricated charges shortly after filing complaints, a pattern of retaliation so obvious it's stunning it went unchallenged for so long." "How many officers are implicated?" Hoffman asked. "Directly, 47, but the culture of silence and protection extends far beyond those individuals. We're talking about supervisors who ignored red flags, administrators who prioritized department image over accountability, and union representatives who treated every complaint as an attack on law enforcement rather than an opportunity for reform." Representative Chen leaned forward. "Attorney General, are you suggesting we have a police department full of corrupt officers? Because that's a dangerous narrative to push." Lim's jaw tightened. "I'm suggesting we have a system that protects bad officers at the expense of good ones. The vast majority of Metro PD officers are honorable people trying to do a difficult job. But when the system makes it nearly impossible to remove the few who abuse their power, it poisons the entire profession." Kiara watched as the committee members absorbed this, their faces reflecting the complexity of the problem. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was institutional rot, the kind that couldn't be solved with a single arrest or resignation. After 2 more hours of testimony, victim statements read into the record, expert analysis of police accountability systems, heated debates about reform measures, the hearing finally adjourned. Kiara met her mother in a private conference room down the hall, where Elise collapsed into a chair and rubbed her temples. "Well," Elise said dryly, "that was fun." "Chen's an ass," Kiara said, sitting across from her. "A family dispute? Are you kidding me?" "He's playing to his base," Elise replied, "but he's also scared. They all are. Because if this investigation proves what we think it proves, the entire department is going to have to be restructured from the ground up. That's expensive. That's politically complicated. That's the kind of reform that makes enemies." "Good," Kiara said fiercely. "Let them be scared. Maybe then they'll actually do something." Elise smiled faintly. "You sound like me at your age. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Before Kiara could respond, Marcus burst into the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression urgent. He covered the receiver and said, "We have a problem. Rusk's defense team just leaked internal documents to the press, emails between you, the AG's office, and victim advocates. They're claiming it proves collusion and political bias." Elise was on her feet instantly. "What emails?" "Strategy discussions, mostly. Nothing illegal, but they're spinning it as evidence that you orchestrated a witch hunt." Guessing. Marcus pulled up a news site on his tablet and showed them the headline. "Governor Reed's Secret War on Police. Leaked emails reveal coordinated attack on decorated officer." Kiara felt her stomach drop. "How did they get those emails?" "We don't know yet," Marcus said grimly. "But they're out there now, and the narrative is spreading fast. Conservative outlets are running with it hard, calling for an ethics investigation, demanding you recuse yourself from anything related to police oversight. Elise's face went cold and calculating. Get me Lim on the phone. And our communications director. We're getting ahead of this right now. Within an hour, they'd assembled in the governor's office, a crisis team consisting of Elise, Marcus, David Lim, the communications director Stephanie Park, and Jolene from Victim Services. Kiara sat in the corner listening as they debated strategy. We need to be transparent, Stephanie argued. Release all the emails ourselves, show there's nothing to hide. If we let them control the narrative, we lose. Releasing everything could compromise ongoing investigations, Lim countered. Some of those communications contain sensitive information about witnesses and evidence. Then we redact what needs to be redacted and release the rest, Elise said decisively. Stephanie's right. We can't let them paint this as a conspiracy. We show exactly what happened, a governor exercising legitimate authority, coordinating with law enforcement professionals to address a systemic crisis. What about the leak itself? Marcus asked. Someone with access to secure communications gave those documents to Rusk's lawyers. That's either a mole in our office or a major security breach. Elise's expression darkened. Denise is already tracking it down. Whoever did this will be found and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Kiara spoke up from her corner. Can I say something? Everyone turned to look at her. Elise nodded. Maybe we're looking at this wrong, Kiara said slowly. They leaked those emails to make it look like we're the villains, right? Like we're out to destroy some poor, innocent cop. But what if we use this as an opportunity to show people exactly how hard it is to hold police accountable? What if we don't just defend ourselves? What if we go on offense? Stephanie tilted her head. What do you mean? I mean, we don't just release the emails, we contextualize them. We show that every single step we took was necessary because the normal system failed. We highlight all the times victims tried to get justice and were shut down. We make it crystal clear that if this is what it takes to remove one abusive officer, a governor's intervention, an attorney general investigation, legislative hearings, then the system is fundamentally broken. The room fell silent as they considered this. Then Lim nodded slowly. That's actually brilliant. We're not apologizing for our actions. We're indicting the system that made our actions necessary. I like it, Elise said. Stephanie, can you build a communication strategy around that? Absolutely, Stephanie replied, already typing notes. We'll need testimonials from victims, data on complaint dismissals, comparative analysis of other jurisdictions. Make it a story about systemic failure, not personal vendetta. Do it, Elise ordered, and I want it ready to deploy by tomorrow morning. We're not giving them another day to control this narrative. As the meeting broke up and people scattered to their assigned tasks, Elise pulled Kiara aside. That was good thinking, baby. Really good. Kiara shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just don't want them to win, not after everything we've uncovered. They won't, Elise promised. But I need you to understand something. This fight is going to get uglier before it gets better. They're going to come after you personally now, not just your credibility, but your character. They'll dig up every mistake you've ever made, every friend you've had, every photo from college parties. They'll try to paint you as entitled, privileged, vindictive. You need to be prepared for that. I am, Kiara said, though her voice wavered slightly. I have to be. Because if I back down, if I let them intimidate me into silence, then every other victim out there loses hope. Elise cupped her daughter's face in her hands. When did you get so strong? I learned from the best, Kiara replied, and for the first time in days they both smiled. The counteroffensive launched at dawn. Governor Reed held a press conference at 7 a.m., flanked by Attorney General Lim and 3 victims willing to speak publicly, Vanessa, Amara, and a man named Derek Williams, who'd been beaten so badly by Rusk during a traffic stop that he'd spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The leaked emails were released simultaneously on the governor's website, accompanied by a comprehensive report detailing the Metro PD's history of dismissing complaints. Elise spoke for exactly 12 minutes, her words precise and devastating. Yesterday, Officer Rusk's defense team leaked internal communications in an attempt to discredit this investigation. I'm here today to provide full context for those communications and to make one thing abundantly clear. If coordinating with law enforcement professionals to remove a violent officer from the streets is a witch hunt, then every police department in this country needs to be investigated. She detailed the timeline. How many complaints had been filed against Rusk? How many had been dismissed? How many victims had been ignored or retaliated against? She explained her decision to invoke state oversight, citing specific legal precedents. And then she pivoted to the broader issue. The leaked emails show exactly how difficult it is to achieve accountability when the system is designed to protect itself. We didn't orchestrate this investigation because we wanted to. We orchestrated it because we had to. Because 17 complaints weren't enough. Because decades of documented abuse weren't enough. Because without extraordinary intervention, Officer Rusk would still be on the streets, and his next victim might not have survived. Then she stepped aside and let the victim speak. Vanessa described filing her complaint and being told nothing could be done. Amar explained how reporting Rusk's excessive force had cost her her career. Derek, his voice still raspy from the injuries he'd sustained 5 years ago, held up photos of his brutalized face and said simply, "This is what happens when no one is watching. This is what happens when officers know they're untouchable." The press conference went viral immediately. Within hours, it had eclipsed the leaked email story entirely. Major networks played it in full. Social media exploded with support. Even some conservative commentators who'd initially sided with Rusk began to waver as the evidence became undeniable. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. That afternoon, as Kiara was scrolling through her phone in her dorm room, she'd finally returned to campus, security detail in tow. A video notification popped up. It was from the Metro Police Officers Association, the union representing rank-and-file cops. She clicked it, expecting more attacks. Instead, she saw Officer Maria Delgado, the same officer who'd removed Kiara's handcuffs the night of the party, standing before a microphone, flanked by 6 other officers in uniform. "My name is Officer Maria Delgado, and I've been with Metro PD for 8 years, she began, her voice shaking but determined. "I joined this department because I wanted to help people. I wanted to make my community safer. But over the past several weeks, as the investigation into Officer Rusk has unfolded, I've had to confront some hard truths about the institution I serve." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was there the night Officer Rusk assaulted Kiara Reed. I saw what he did. I heard the lies he told. And I did what I was trained to do. I followed the senior officer's lead. I didn't question him. I didn't challenge him. And because of that, I almost helped him destroy an innocent woman's life." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "The officers standing with me today represent a growing number of us who are tired of the code of silence. We're tired of watching bad cops poison the badge we wear. We're tired of being told that accountability is an attack on law enforcement, when really, it's the only thing that can save it." One of the officers beside her, a middle-aged black man with 20 years on his uniform, stepped forward. "My name is Sergeant Jerome Mason. I've filed 3 complaints against colleagues for excessive force over my career. All 3 were dismissed, and I was labeled a troublemaker for my efforts. But after seeing Governor Reed and these brave victims stand up to a system that failed them, I can't stay silent anymore." Another officer, a young white woman who looked barely older than Kiara, spoke next. "I'm Officer Hannah Lee. I witnessed Officer Rusk use racial slurs during roll call multiple times. When I reported it to my supervisor, I was told it was just locker room talk, and I needed to develop a thicker skin. That's not acceptable. It's never been acceptable. And we need to stop pretending it is." The video continued with each officer sharing their story. Retaliation they'd faced for reporting misconduct, complaints they'd seen buried, colleagues they knew shouldn't be on the force, but were protected by seniority and union rules. By the end, all 7 were calling for comprehensive reform, independent oversight boards, mandatory public reporting of use of force incidents, an end to qualified immunity, better training, psychological evaluations, and cultural change from the top down. When the video ended, Kiara sat in stunned silence. Tasha, who'd been watching over her shoulder, whispered, "Holy shit, cops are breaking ranks." "Not all of them," Kiara said, "but enough. Maybe enough to make a difference." She immediately forwarded the video to her mother, Marcus, and the entire team. Within minutes, her phone rang. It was Elise. "Did you see it?" Kiara asked. "I did," Elise replied, and her voice was thick with emotion. "This changes everything, Kiara. When officers themselves start demanding accountability, when they break the blue wall, That's when real reform becomes possible. So what do we do now? We support them, Elise said firmly. We protect them from retaliation. We amplify their voices. And we use this momentum to push through legislation that makes these changes permanent. Over the next week, the movement grew. More officers came forward, some publicly, some anonymously through whistleblower channels. The police union fractured, with younger members pushing back against leadership's reflexive defense of Rusk. The Metro PD chief of police, under intense pressure, announced his resignation and called for an independent review of department practices. Chiara became the reluctant face of this transformation. She didn't ask for it, didn't particularly want it, but everywhere she went, people recognized her. Some thanked her, some cursed her. One woman stopped her outside a coffee shop and hugged her, crying, saying her son had been beaten by police 3 years ago and no one had believed him until now. The weight of it all pressed down on Chiara like a physical thing. She couldn't walk across campus without security. She couldn't go to class without students whispering and pointing. Her professors were supportive, but clearly unsure how to handle having someone so publicly controversial in their classrooms. One particularly bad day, Chiara skipped all her classes and sat alone in her dorm, curtains drawn, scrolling through hateful messages on her phone until Tasha physically took the device away. "Enough," Tasha said firmly. "You're torturing yourself again." "They want me dead," Chiara said flatly, showing Tasha one particularly graphic threat. "That's the third one this week." "I know," Tasha replied gently, "and we've reported them all to the FBI. But you can't let these trolls win, Key. You can't let them make you believe you did something wrong." "I didn't do anything," Chiara said, her voice breaking. "I just defended myself. I just told the truth. And now my entire life is about this one night, this one moment. I can't escape it. I can't move on. It's like I'm frozen in that party forever, with his hand around my throat." Tasha pulled her into a fierce hug. "You're not frozen. You're fighting. And yeah, it sucks. It's unfair that you have to carry this weight, but you're also saving lives, Key. Every person who comes forward because you showed them it was possible, that's because of your courage. Every cop who breaks ranks because they saw you refuse to back down, that's your impact. You're changing the world, even when it hurts." Chiara cried then, really cried, in a way she hadn't let herself since that first night. She cried for the girl in the green dress who just wanted one normal evening. She cried for Vanessa and Amara and Derek and all the others carrying wounds that would never fully heal. She cried for the officers like Delgado and Mason who were risking their careers to do the right thing. And when she was done crying, she wiped her face, took a deep breath, and texted her mother, "What's the next step? I'm ready?" The next step came in the form of legislation. Governor Reed, working with sympathetic legislators and community advocates, drafted the Police Accountability and Transparency Act, a comprehensive reform package that addressed nearly every systemic failure the investigation had uncovered. It mandated independent civilian review boards with real authority to investigate complaints. It required all use-of-force incidents to be publicly reported within 72 hours. It ended qualified immunity for officers who violated clearly established constitutional rights. It created a statewide database tracking officer misconduct so problematic cops couldn't simply move to different departments. And it allocated funding for better training, mental health support, and community policing initiatives. The bill was ambitious, too ambitious, some said. It faced immediate opposition from the police union, conservative legislators, and law enforcement lobbies who painted it as a radical attack on public safety. But it also had momentum. The investigation had created a rare window of political will. Victims had mobilized. Reform advocates had organized, and a critical mass of officers themselves were demanding change. The legislative battle consumed the next month. Chiara testified before committees, sharing her story alongside other victims. Officers like Delgado and Mason testified too, explaining why these reforms were necessary to restore public trust. Community members packed hearing rooms, holding signs that read, "Justice, not impunity," and "Good cops support accountability." The opposition fought hard. They brought in out-of-state police chiefs warning of mass resignations if the bill passed. They funded attack ads suggesting the reforms would lead to chaos and crime. They circulated edited versions of Chiara's testimony designed to make her look vindictive and privileged. But the truth, documented, undeniable, devastating, was stronger than their spin. On a snowy evening in mid-January, nearly 3 months after the party that changed everything, the state legislature voted on the Police Accountability and Transparency Act. Kiara watched from the gallery, squeezed between her mother and Vanessa, holding her breath as the votes were tallied. The bill passed by a margin of 8 votes, narrower than they'd hoped, but enough. The gallery erupted in applause and tears. Strangers hugged. Victims sobbed with relief. Elise squeezed Kiara's hand so hard it hurt, and Kiara squeezed back just as fiercely. They'd won. Not completely. There would be implementation battles, legal challenges, resistance from entrenched interests. But they'd won the first critical fight. They'd turned trauma into transformation. As they left the Capitol building that night, snow falling gently around them, Kiara felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the naive hope of someone who thought the world was fair, but the hard-earned hope of someone who knew it wasn't, but refused to stop fighting to make it better. A reporter called out from the crowd. Kiara, how does it feel to have helped pass this historic legislation? Kiara paused, considering her answer carefully. Then she smiled, a real smile, tired but genuine. It feels like we're finally building a system where justice isn't a privilege reserved for people powerful enough to demand it. It feels like the beginning of something better. And it feels like all those people who've been hurt and silenced finally have a reason to believe their voices matter. She looked at the survivors standing around her, Vanessa, Amara, Derek, and others who'd become her allies and friends through this nightmare. This isn't my victory, she added quietly. It's ours, all of ours. And we're not done yet. The words had barely left Kiara's mouth when the cameras flashed like lightning, freezing that moment in time. The snow falling around them, the survivors standing united, the promise of something better hanging in the cold January air. But promises, Kiara was learning, were easier to make than to keep. The real work began the next morning. While the state celebrated the passage of the Police Accountability and Transparency Act, while news outlets ran triumphant headlines about historic reform, Kiara sat in a conference room at the Attorney General's office and listened to David Lim explain why their victory was only the beginning of a much longer battle. The law passed, Lim said, his tone measured and careful, but implementation is going to be a war. The police union has already announced they're filing a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the civilian review boards. 3 departments in conservative districts have declared they'll refuse to comply with the reporting requirements. And we've received credible threats against several legislators who voted yes. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. So we passed a law that half the state intends to ignore? Not ignore, challenge, Lim corrected. They'll tie it up in court for months, maybe years. They'll argue the reforms are unfunded mandates, that they violate collective bargaining agreements, that they interfere with local control. Every procedural delay they can manufacture, they will. Kiara felt her earlier hope curdle into something harder. So what was the point? If they can just refuse to follow the law, what did we actually accomplish? Elise, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. We accomplished leverage. Before this law, they could dismiss complaints with impunity because there was no legal requirement for transparency. Now there is. Now when they refuse to comply, they're breaking the law, and we can use every tool at our disposal to force compliance. Including federal intervention, Lim added. I've been in contact with the Department of Justice. They're watching this closely. If local departments engage in systematic non-compliance, DOJ can step in with consent decrees and federal oversight. The law gives us the framework. Now we have to enforce it. Jolene Hiss, who'd been taking notes furiously, looked up. What about Officer Rusk's trial? That's still moving forward, right? Trial's set for March, Lim confirmed. Jury selection starts in 6 weeks. His defense is going to argue that the entire prosecution is tainted by political bias, that the investigation was predetermined, that the governor's involvement compromised due process. It's going to be ugly. Let them argue that, Kiara said, her voice harder than she intended. We have videos. We have witnesses. We have 12 other victims testifying to a pattern of behavior. If they want to make this about politics, we'll make it about evidence. Lim nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. But you need to be prepared for what the defense is going to throw at you personally. They're going to dissect your entire life. Every social media post, every party you attended, every relationship you've had. They'll try to paint you as vindictive, privileged, someone who weaponized her mother's power because you couldn't handle being told no. Kiara's jaw tightened. Bring it on. I've been called worse in the last 3 months. But preparing for trial meant reliving the worst night of her life in excruciating detail. Over the next several weeks, Kiara spent hours with the prosecution team, going through her testimony line by line, anticipating every possible attack the defense might launch. They showed her photos of her bruises, videos of the assault, transcripts of what witnesses had heard. Each session left her exhausted and raw, but she forced herself to push through. Vanessa and the other victims went through the same grueling preparation. They met regularly, sometimes at the AG's office, sometimes at a victim advocacy center, once at Kiara's dorm where they ordered pizza and tried to pretend they were just normal people having a normal night. But the trial loomed over everything like a shadow. I'm scared, Vanessa admitted one evening as they sat in Kiara's room, supposedly reviewing their testimony but mostly just staring at their notes. What if the jury doesn't believe us? What if they decide Rusk was justified? Then we appeal, Kiara said firmly. And we keep fighting. We don't stop until justice is done. But what if it's never done? Vanessa's voice cracked. What if we go through all of this, the testimony, the cross-examination, the public humiliation, and he walks free anyway? Kiara didn't have an answer for that. The question haunted her too, especially late at night when she couldn't sleep and her mind replayed every moment of the assault. What if the system, even reformed, even watched, still chose to protect its own? What if 12 jurors looked at all the evidence and decided that a cop's word still mattered more than theirs? But she couldn't let Vanessa see that fear. So instead, she reached across the bed and took her friend's hand. If that happens, Kiara said slowly, then we'll know we did everything we could. We'll know we told the truth, we stood up when it mattered, and we refused to be silenced. That's worth something, even if the verdict isn't what we want. Vanessa nodded, wiping her eyes. You really believe that? I have to, Kiara replied. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? Meanwhile, the resistance to the reform law intensified. Police union representatives appeared on every news show that would have them, painting dire pictures of a state descending into lawlessness. Crime statistics were cherry-picked and misrepresented to suggest that accountability measures would lead to chaos. Officers organized rallies featuring families of fallen police, using genuine tragedy to argue against oversight. The attacks on Kiara personally escalated too. Someone leaked her college transcript, not because there was anything damaging in it, but just to violate her privacy. Her dorm address was posted on extremist forums, alongside suggestions of what patriots should do about spoiled daughters who destroy good men. The FBI investigated, made a few arrests, but the threats kept coming. Elise wanted Kiara to move back to the governor's residence full-time. Kiara refused. She'd already lost so much of her normal life. She wouldn't let them take her independence too. So they compromised. Enhanced security, panic buttons, restricted access to her dorm floor, and a promise that she'd call immediately if anything felt wrong. It felt wrong most of the time now. The looks from other students who blamed her for making their campus a security zone. The whispers in her classes. The way some people treated her like a hero while others treated her like a terrorist. The constant awareness that she was being watched. By security, by media, by people who wished her harm. Tasha remained her lifeline. The one person who still treated her like Kai instead of Kiara Reed. The governor's daughter. The girl who brought down a cop. They studied together, complained about professors together, binged terrible TV shows together, stolen moments of normalcy in a life that had become anything but normal. You know what I miss most? Kiara said one night as they lay on her dorm floor sharing a pint of ice cream. Being boring. Remember when the most dramatic thing in my life was worrying about my GPA? Tasha laughed. Girl, you were never boring. But yeah, I get it. You miss being anonymous. I miss feeling safe, Kiara corrected. I miss walking across campus without wondering if someone's going to recognize me and start shit. I miss just being a student. You're still a student, Tasha pointed out. A student who also happens to be changing the entire criminal justice system. That's just multitasking. Kiara threw a pillow at her. Shut up. But Tasha's point, however flippantly made, was valid. Kiara was still attending classes, albeit irregularly. She was still working on her double major in sociology and political science. Her professors had been remarkably accommodating, understanding that her real-world education in systemic reform was as valuable as anything in their syllabi. One professor, Dr. Angela Reeves, pulled Kiara aside after a class on social movements and said, "You're living the theories we teach. That's rare. Most students study change from a distance. You're in the middle of it." "It's exhausting," Kiara admitted. "The most important work usually is," Dr. Reeves replied, "but don't lose sight of why it matters. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for the idea that justice should be accessible to everyone, not just those with power. That's worth being exhausted for." Those words sustained Kiara through February, as the trial date approached and the tension ratcheted higher. The defense team, led by a notorious attorney named Mitchell Crawford, who specialized in defending police officers, began their media campaign early. Crawford was smooth, silver-haired, and devastatingly effective at shaping narratives. He appeared on a popular talk show and delivered what became his signature argument. Officer Rusk is a dedicated public servant with 15 years of exemplary service who made a single mistake on his worst day. He was off-duty, admittedly intoxicated, and he exercised poor judgment. But the response to that poor judgment has been wildly disproportionate. The governor has mobilized the entire apparatus of state power against one man because he had the misfortune of encountering her daughter. This isn't justice. It's revenge. Kiara watched the interview and felt sick. Crawford was good. He acknowledged just enough fault to seem reasonable while reframing the entire incident as a personal vendetta. He mentioned Rusk's years of service but conveniently ignored the 17 complaints. He called the assault poor judgment, as if choking someone was equivalent to forgetting to return a library book. "We need to respond to that," Kiara told her mother that evening. "We can't let him control the narrative." "The prosecution will address it in court," Elise said carefully. "That's where it matters." "But public opinion matters too," Kiara argued. "If Crawford convinces people that this is political persecution, the jury will feel that pressure. They'll be less willing to convict." Marcus, who was present for the conversation, nodded slowly. "She's not wrong. Crawford's strategy is to poison the well, make people doubt the legitimacy of the prosecution before the evidence is even presented. We need a counter-narrative." They spent the next week crafting their response, not through media appearances. Lim had advised against that, not wanting to appear too political, but through a carefully coordinated campaign highlighting the other victims. Op-eds written by survivors appeared in major newspapers. Vanessa did a podcast interview explaining why she'd come forward. Derek gave a video statement describing how Rusk's beating had left him with permanent nerve damage. The message was clear. This wasn't about one incident or one victim. This was about a pattern of violence spanning years, affecting dozens of lives, enabled by a system that prioritized protecting police over protecting people. And slowly, the narrative began to shift back. Jury selection began on a cold Monday in early March. Kiara sat in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by other survivors and supporters, watching as potential jurors were questioned about their views on police, their exposure to media coverage, their ability to be impartial. The process was excruciating, each side exercising challenges, debating in hushed tones, jockeying for advantage. Mitchell Crawford wanted jurors who were older, conservative, skeptical of government overreach. The prosecution wanted jurors who were younger, more diverse, more willing to question authority. After 3 days of selection, they finally seated 12 jurors and 4 alternates, a mix of ages, races, and backgrounds that both sides claimed was acceptable. Opening statements began on Thursday. The lead prosecutor, a brilliant woman named Sarah Chen, stood before the jury and spoke with quiet intensity. "This case is about power and accountability. It's about what happens when someone entrusted with authority abuses that trust." On the night of November 14th, Officer Nolan Rusk attended a private party. He was off duty. He was intoxicated. And when a young woman named Kiara Reed had the audacity to challenge his behavior, he assaulted her. Sarah paused, letting the words settle. But this case is about more than one night. It's about a pattern of behavior spanning 15 years. It's about 17 complaints filed against Officer Rusk, complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, false arrest, all dismissed by a system designed to protect him rather than the people he swore to serve. The evidence will show that Officer Rusk believed himself untouchable, and the evidence will show that he was almost right. Then Mitchell Crawford took his turn. He was older than Sarah, more theatrical, and he played to the jury like a conductor leading an orchestra. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not here to tell you that Officer Rusk is perfect. He's not. He made mistakes that night. He drank too much. He argued with Ms. Reed when he should have walked away. But making mistakes doesn't make you a criminal. It makes you human. Crawford walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. The prosecution wants you to believe this is about a pattern of abuse. But what they're really asking you to do is convict a man based on unproven allegations from years past. Allegations that were investigated and dismissed by his own department. They want you to ignore due process because the alleged victim happens to be the governor's daughter. He let that hang in the air. This case is about a family with unlimited resources and political power going after a working-class cop who made them angry. That's not justice. That's persecution. And I'm confident that when you see all the evidence, not the cherry-picked videos and coached testimony, but the complete picture, you'll recognize that Officer Rusk is not a predator. He's a scapegoat. Kiara gripped the armrest of her seat so hard her knuckles went white. Beside her, Vanessa was shaking. Behind them, Amara muttered a curse under her breath. The prosecution spent the next week methodically building their case. They called witnesses from the party who described what they'd seen. Rusk's aggressive behavior, his insulting comments, the assault itself. They played the videos, forcing the jury to watch as Rusk slapped Kiara, choked her, dragged her outside. They brought in medical experts who testified about her injuries. The bruising, the torn dress, the marks on her throat consistent with strangulation. And then they called the other victims. Vanessa took the stand first. She wore a simple gray dress and spoke in a voice that trembled at first, but grew stronger as she told her story. She described the traffic stop, the baseless accusations, the violence, the humiliation of the strip search. She described filing a complaint and being dismissed. She described 3 years of nightmares and panic attacks. Crawford's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned why she hadn't called a lawyer immediately. He suggested her sobriety made her unreliable. Recovering addicts often have difficulty distinguishing between reality and perception. Isn't that true? He implied she was motivated by the prospect of a civil lawsuit and settlement money. Vanessa held her ground. "I don't want money," she said firmly. "I want him to stop hurting people." One by one, the other victims testified. Amara described her destroyed career. Derek spoke haltingly about the permanent nerve damage in his left hand. A woman named Lisa Martinez described being pepper sprayed during a peaceful protest while Rusk laughed. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its core. A powerful man abusing his authority because he believed he could. Crawford attacked each of them with varying strategies, questioning their credibility, suggesting ulterior motives, highlighting inconsistencies in statements made years apart. But the sheer weight of testimony, the pattern that emerged, was damning. Then it was Kiara's turn. She'd prepared for this moment for months, but when the bailiff called her name, her legs felt like water. She walked to the witness stand on autopilot, raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth. Then she sat and looked out at the courtroom, at the judge, the jury, the packed gallery, the cameras, and finally at Rusk himself, sitting at the defense table in a dark suit, looking nothing like the monster who'd choked her, but everything like a man who thought he could still win. Sarah Chen approached with a gentle smile. "Ms. Reed, can you tell the jury what happened on the night of November 14th? Kiara took a breath and began. She described going to the party, wanting one normal night. She described Rusk's comments, the way he'd cornered her in the kitchen, his threatening demeanor. She described standing up to him, walking away, and thinking she was safe. "And then what happened?" Sarah prompted. "He hit me," Kiara said simply, "in front of everyone. And when I tried to breathe, when I tried to speak, he put his hand around my throat and squeezed until I couldn't." "Were you afraid?" "Terrified. I thought he might actually kill me." "What did you do?" "I looked at all the phones recording and said, 'Everyone's watching,' because I knew that was my only chance, making sure people saw what he was doing." Sarah walked her through the rest, the false arrest, the fabricated charges, the moment she'd invoked her mother's name, the arrival of the governor's team. Kiara answered each question carefully, sticking to facts, avoiding emotion even when her voice shook. Then Crawford stood for cross-examination, and the real battle began. "Ms. Reed," he said, his tone friendly but his eyes cold, "you testified that you were terrified, but you also testified that you confronted Officer Rusk verbally before the alleged assault. Isn't it true that you called him a bully?" "Yes. And you said he was terrified of women like you, correct?" "Yes." "That's pretty aggressive language, isn't it? Almost provocative?" Sarah objected. "Argumentative." The judge sustained the objection, but Crawford had made his point. He spent the next hour trying to paint Kiara as the aggressor, someone who'd deliberately provoked Rusk, who'd escalated the situation, who'd then used her family's power to destroy him when the confrontation went poorly. "Isn't it true, Ms. Reed, that you were raised in a household where you learned to use power to get what you want?" "Objection!" Sarah's voice was sharp. "That's not a question. It's an insult." "Sustained. Counselor, ask proper questions or move on." Crawford pivoted. "Let me ask it differently. Your mother is one of the most powerful people in the state. Growing up with that kind of privilege, wouldn't you say you're accustomed to getting your way?" Kiara met his eyes steadily. "My mother taught me to use whatever power I have to protect people who can't protect themselves. That's exactly what I'm doing now." The gallery erupted in applause. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order, but Kiara saw several jurors nodding. Crawford tried a different approach. "You claim Officer Rusk choked you, but isn't it true that you have no permanent injuries? No lasting damage?" "I have scars," Kiara said quietly, "just not the kind you can see in photographs." "But you're fine now, aren't you? You're back in school, living your life." "I'm surviving," Kiara corrected. "That's not the same as being fine." Crawford pressed harder, questioning why she hadn't left the party earlier, why she'd engaged with Rusk at all, whether she'd had any alcohol that night despite her claim otherwise. He tried to suggest she was misremembering details, that her fear had distorted her perception, that her family's intervention had convinced her something criminal had happened when really it was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Kiara didn't break. She answered each question calmly, referring back to the videos when Crawford's version contradicted what was clearly recorded. And when he finally ran out of angles to attack, when he'd exhausted every strategy to discredit her, she looked at him and said something that would be quoted in every news report that night. "You can question my memory, my motives, my privilege. That's your job. But you can't question what happened because it's on video. Dozens of people saw it, recorded it, and no amount of clever lawyering is going to change the fact that your client assaulted me because he thought he could get away with it." Crawford's jaw tightened. No further questions. As Kiara stepped down from the witness stand, her legs shaking but her head high, she caught her mother's eye in the gallery. Elise was crying, actually crying, and mouthed the words, "I'm so proud of you." The prosecution rested their case the next day. The defense called their own witnesses, character witnesses who testified to Rusk's years of service, experts who questioned the reliability of eyewitness testimony, a psychologist who suggested Rusk had been suffering from alcohol-induced impairment that diminished his capacity for intent. They even called Rusk himself to testify. He sat in the witness box looking remorseful and beaten down, nothing like the arrogant man who'd grinned while choking Kiara. He described the stress of his job, the pressure of being a cop in an increasingly hostile environment. He admitted he'd been drinking, admitted he'd argued with Kiara, but claimed he'd only touched her to prevent her from falling and that his attempt to arrest her had been based on genuine concern that she was intoxicated. "I made mistakes," Rusk said, his voice breaking. "I should never have been at that party. I should never have had that much to drink. But I swear on everything I hold sacred, I never intended to hurt anyone. I was trying to do my job, and it went wrong." Sarah Chen destroyed him on cross-examination. She walked him through each of the 17 prior complaints, forcing him to address why so many people over so many years had accused him of similar behavior. She played the videos again, pausing at key moments to ask him to explain exactly how choking someone constituted preventing her from falling. She read his arrest report, the one claiming Kiara had assaulted him, and asked him to point out which part of the video supported that claim. By the time Sarah was done, Rusk's story had collapsed into obvious lies and contradictions. He left the stand looking not remorseful, but exposed. A man who'd finally run out of excuses. Closing arguments took place on a Friday. Sarah Chen spoke for 90 minutes, methodically walking the jury through the evidence, the pattern, the lies. She ended with a simple statement. Officer Rusk had power. He abused it. And when he was finally held accountable, he called it persecution. But accountability isn't persecution, it's justice. And I'm asking you to deliver it. Mitchell Crawford spoke for even longer, painting Rusk as a tragic figure, a flawed man being sacrificed to political ambition and mob justice. In a fair world, he said, this case would never have been brought. But we don't live in a fair world. We live in a world where powerful families can weaponize the legal system against ordinary people. I'm asking you not to be part of that. I'm asking you to see Officer Rusk as a human being who made mistakes, not a monster who deserves to be destroyed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days during which Kiara barely slept, barely ate, paced her dorm room until Tasha threatened to physically restrain her. 2 days during which every moment of the trial replayed in her mind, every answer she'd given, every question she hadn't anticipated. 2 days of wondering if she'd done enough, said enough, been enough to convince 12 strangers that justice mattered more than protecting the badge. On Sunday afternoon, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when they reconvened an hour later. Kiara sat in her usual spot, flanked by her mother on one side and Vanessa on the other. The other victims filled the rows behind them. Press packed the back of the room. And at the defense table, Rusk sat very still, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Then they sat, and the silence was suffocating. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Reyes asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who'd been mostly expressionless throughout the trial, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of assault in the first degree, how do you find? The foreman looked directly at Rusk. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered, cried, shouted. Judge Reyes banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the noise continued. Kiara felt Vanessa collapse against her, sobbing. She felt her mother's arm around her shoulders. She felt something inside herself, something that had been clenched tight since that November night. Finally begin to loosen. The foreman continued reading verdicts. Guilty on battery. Guilty on false arrest. Guilty on falsifying police reports. Guilty on abuse of authority. Guilty on every single charge. Mitchell Crawford slumped in his chair. Rusk sat frozen, his face blank with shock. And Kiara, watching the man who'd tried to destroy her realize his career, his freedom, his entire life was over, felt not triumph, but a strange, exhausted relief. Justice, she thought, didn't feel like victory. It felt like the absence of fear. The gavel's final bang echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Judge Reyes ordered Rusk remanded into custody pending sentencing, and 2 bailiffs moved forward to take him away. For just a moment, as they fastened the handcuffs around his wrists, the same wrists that had grabbed Kiara, choked her, dragged her, Rusk looked back over his shoulder. His eyes found Kiara's across the crowded room. There was no defiance left in them now, no arrogance, no swagger, just the hollowed-out expression of a man who'd finally been forced to face the consequences of his actions. Kiara held his gaze until he turned away, shuffling toward the side door in shackles, and she felt something shift deep in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but closure. The man who'd made her afraid was now the one being led away in chains. The courtroom slowly emptied as people filed out into the hallway where reporters had assembled like a hungry pack. Kiara stood with Vanessa, Amara, Derek, and the other survivors, all of them still processing what had just happened. Vanessa was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and Amara kept whispering, "We won. We actually won," as if she couldn't quite believe it. Outside, the March wind was sharp and cold, but the sun was shining brilliantly, one of those clear spring days that felt like a promise. Sarah Chen stood at a makeshift podium surrounded by microphones, with David Lim beside her and Governor Reed just behind. Kiara hung back with the other victims, watching as Sarah addressed the press. Today, a jury of 12 ordinary citizens looked at the evidence and reached a unanimous conclusion. Officer Nolan Rusk is guilty of assault, battery, false arrest, and abuse of authority. This verdict sends a clear message that badge or no badge, no one is above the law. But this case was never just about one officer or one incident. It was about a system that for too long protected abusers and silenced victims. Sarah paused, her voice growing stronger. Today's verdict is the direct result of courageous survivors who refused to stay silent. It's the result of a governor who used her authority not to seek revenge, but to demand accountability. And it's the result of good officers, officers like Maria Delgado and Jerome Mason, who broke ranks to tell the truth. This is what justice looks like when we choose courage over complicity. Reporters shouted questions. Sarah answered a few before stepping aside to let Lim speak about the broader investigation into the Metro Police Department. Then Elise took the microphone and Kiara saw her mother transform from parent back into governor, shoulders squared, voice measured, every word carefully chosen. "I want to be clear about something," Elise said. "My daughter's case received attention because of who I am. That's the privilege she had, and I won't pretend otherwise. But that privilege also illuminated how broken the system is for everyone else. 12 other victims came forward in this case. How many more are out there who didn't? How many complaints were buried? How many lives were destroyed because the system chose protection over accountability?" She looked directly into the cameras. "The police accountability and transparency. Act that we passed wasn't about punishing good officers. It was about creating a system where bad officers can no longer hide, where complaints are investigated by independent bodies, where use of force is documented and reviewed, where the people we trust with power are held to the highest standards, not the lowest." Elise's voice softened slightly. "My daughter didn't ask to become the face of this movement. She just wanted justice. But in fighting for herself, she created space for others to fight too. That's what leadership looks like. That's what courage looks like. And I've never been more proud to be her mother." The crowd erupted in applause. Kiara felt tears streaming down her face and didn't bother wiping them away. Her mother caught her eye through the crowd and smiled, a private moment of connection in the midst of public triumph. Then the reporters turned their attention to the survivors, calling out questions, asking for reactions. Kiara took a deep breath, stepped forward to the microphone, and felt Vanessa's hand slip into hers on one side, Amara's on the other. They stood together, this small army of people who'd been broken by the same man and had somehow found strength in their shared pain. "I'm not going to stand here and say this feels like a complete victory," Kiara began, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "Because Rusk's conviction doesn't undo the trauma he caused. It doesn't give Vanessa back the 3 years she spent thinking no one would believe her. It doesn't heal Derek's nerve damage. It doesn't restore Amara's career." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But it does prove that change is possible. It proves that when survivors speak up, when good officers break the code of silence, when communities demand accountability, the system can bend toward justice. It's slow. It's painful. It's imperfect. But it can happen." A reporter called out, "What do you say to people who claim this prosecution was politically motivated?" Kiara didn't hesitate. "I say they're welcome to review the evidence themselves. 30 witnesses, multiple videos, 12 victims, a 15-year pattern of complaints. If holding someone accountable for documented violence is political, then I hope every prosecutor in this country gets political really quickly." Another reporter, "What's next for you?" Kiara glanced at her mother, then back at the cameras. "I'm going back to school. I'm finishing my degree, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure what happened to us can't happen to anyone else. The law we passed is just the beginning. Implementation is the hard part. Enforcement is the hard part. Cultural change is the hard part. But that's the work that matters." She felt Vanessa squeeze her hand, and she squeezed back. "And I'm not doing it alone. None of us are. That's the whole point." The press conference continued for another 20 minutes before Elise's staff finally managed to shepherd everyone toward the waiting vehicles. Kiara rode back to the governor's residence in her mother's car, squeezed between Elise and Marcus, all of them too exhausted and overwhelmed to say much of anything. When they arrived, Denise Ochoa was waiting with updates on the security situation, the inevitable backlash from police union loyalists and far-right groups who saw Rusk's conviction as an attack on law enforcement itself. There had been protests at the courthouse, some peaceful and some not. Online threats had spiked dramatically. Several legislators who'd voted for the reform bill had received death threats. "We're increasing security at the residence," Denise said, "and I'm assigning a permanent detail to Kiara until things settle down." "How long will that take?" Kiara asked wearily. Denise's expression was sympathetic but honest. "Weeks, maybe months. This trial was high profile enough that you're going to remain a target for everyone who thinks Rusk was railroaded." Kiara nodded, too tired to argue. She excused herself and went upstairs to her childhood bedroom, peeling off the professional clothes she'd worn to court and collapsing onto her bed, still wearing her slip. She stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened, but her mind felt like static, too many emotions competing for space. Her phone buzzed. It was Tasha. "I'm coming over. Don't argue. Bringing food and wine and your favorite ice cream. We're celebrating whether you want to or not." Despite everything, Kiara smiled. Tasha arrived 30 minutes later with two other friends from school, and they commandeered the governor's kitchen to make a chaotic dinner of pasta and garlic bread. Elise joined them briefly, charming Kiara's friends with stories about her daughter's childhood determination before retreating to let them have space. For a few hours, Kiara almost felt normal again. They ate too much, laughed too loud, and carefully avoided talking about the trial or the verdict or any of the heavy things that would still be there tomorrow. It was a gift, this pocket of ordinary life in the midst of extraordinary circumstances, and Kiara accepted it gratefully. But later that night, alone in her room with her phone turned off and the house quiet around her, Kiara let herself feel the full weight of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. She thought about the girl in the green dress who'd gone to a party 4 months ago wanting nothing more than one normal night. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone young and naive who still believed the world was fundamentally fair. Kiara wasn't that girl anymore. She'd been forged into something harder, sharper, more aware of how power worked and how justice required constant, exhausting vigilance. She'd lost her anonymity, her sense of safety, her ability to walk through the world without carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations and resentments. But she'd also found something she didn't know she had, a capacity for leadership that went beyond her mother's shadow. A voice that people listened to not because of her last name, but because she'd earned their attention through courage and clarity. A purpose that felt bigger than herself. The tears came then, not sad tears exactly, but the kind that came from releasing something you'd been holding too tightly for too long. She cried for the trauma she'd survived and the innocence she'd lost. She cried for Vanessa and Amara and all the others whose pain she now carried like stones in her pockets. She cried because even though they'd won, winning hurt. And when she was done crying, she slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. The courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different, less tense, more resigned. The verdict had been delivered. Now it was just a matter of determining consequences. Judge Reyes had reviewed dozens of letters submitted on both sides. Rusk's family and former colleagues had written pleading for leniency, describing him as a dedicated father and public servant who'd made mistakes. But those letters were vastly outnumbered by statements from victims. Not just the 12 who'd testified, but dozens more who'd come forward after the trial, emboldened by the guilty verdict. Each statement told a similar story. Encounters with Rusk where he'd been aggressive, abusive, contemptuous of people he viewed as beneath him, traffic stops that escalated into violence, arrests based on fabricated probable cause, searches that violated constitutional rights. Together, they painted a portrait of a man who'd weaponized his badge for 15 years, secure in the belief that the system would always protect him. Kiara sat in the front row again, this time alone. She'd insisted on it, wanting to face this moment without leaning on anyone else. When the judge asked if anyone wished to address the court before sentencing, Kiara stood. "Your Honor, permission to speak?" Judge Reyes nodded. "Ms. Reed, you may approach." Kiara walked to the podium, very aware of Rusk sitting just feet away at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. She'd written notes, but decided not to use them. She needed to speak from the heart, not from a script. "Your Honor, I'm not here to ask for maximum sentencing or to describe how this experience destroyed my life. The evidence already shows what Officer Rusk did. And honestly, my life isn't destroyed. I'm healing. I'm moving forward. I have resources and support that most survivors don't have. She took a breath. But I want the court to understand something. The night Officer Rusk assaulted me, he didn't see a person. He saw someone he thought was powerless. Someone he could hurt without consequence because the system had taught him that was okay. He'd done it before, multiple times. And every time the system dismissed the complaint, buried the evidence, or sided with him over his victims, it sent him a message. You're untouchable. Kiara's voice grew stronger. This case isn't about punishing one bad officer. It's about sending a different message. To every officer who thinks their badge gives them the right to abuse power, and to every victim who's been told their complaint doesn't matter. The message needs to be clear. Abuse of authority has real consequences. Violence has consequences. And the era of quiet cruelty being tolerated in the name of supporting law enforcement is over. She looked directly at Rusk for the first time since entering the courtroom. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something there that might have been remorse, or might just have been self-pity. She couldn't tell, and ultimately, it didn't matter. I hope Officer Rusk spends his time in prison reflecting on the harm he caused, Kiara concluded. But more than that, I hope this sentence makes every other officer think twice before they abuse their power. Because the survivors are watching, we're organized, and we're not going away. She stepped down, her legs steady, her conscience clear. Judge Reyes called a brief recess to review the sentencing guidelines one final time, and when court reconvened, her expression was grave. Officer Rusk, please rise. Rusk stood slowly, his lawyer beside him, both looking like men facing an executioner. The court has considered the evidence presented at trial, the victim impact statements, the letters submitted on your behalf, and the sentencing guidelines for the crimes of which you've been convicted. The evidence shows a sustained pattern of violence and abuse spanning 15 years. It shows a complete disregard for the constitutional rights of the people you swore to protect, and it shows a profound betrayal of the public trust. Judge Reyes paused. The court recognizes that you have a family who loves you, colleagues who vouched for you, and years of service that were not entirely without merit. But the court also recognizes that your position of authority made your crimes more severe, not less. You didn't just assault Ms. Reed, you used the color of law to do it. You attempted to weaponize the criminal justice system against your victim. That represents the worst kind of corruption. Rusk's shoulders slumped. Therefore, the court sentences you to 12 years in state prison on the assault charge, to run consecutively with sentences of 5 years for battery, 3 years for false arrest, 2 years for falsifying police reports, and 5 years for abuse of authority under color of law. Total sentence, 27 years. The gallery erupted. Rusk's family members cried out in anguish. His lawyer immediately announced they would appeal. But through it all, Judge Reyes remained impassive. Additionally, she continued, you are permanently stripped of your law enforcement certification. You will never wear a badge again in any jurisdiction. You will forfeit your pension and benefits. And upon release, you will be required to register as a violent offender and complete 5 years of supervised probation. She looked at Rusk with something that might have been pity. You had power, Officer Rusk. You could have used it to help people. Instead, you used it to hurt them. And now you'll spend more than 2 decades contemplating that choice. This court is adjourned. As bailiffs moved to take Rusk away, he finally broke. He turned toward his family, tears streaming down his face, and mouthed, "I'm sorry," before being led through the side door. His mother collapsed in her seat, sobbing, and Kiara felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for her, a woman who'd loved her son without knowing what he was capable of, now forced to confront the monster he'd become. But that sympathy didn't extend to Rusk himself. He'd had 15 years to change, 15 years of warnings and complaints and chances to be better. He'd chosen violence every time, and now he'd live with those choices. Outside the courthouse, the media circus had somehow grown even larger. News vans lined the street. Protesters held signs, some supporting the verdict, others claiming it was too harsh, a few suggesting Rusk should have gotten life without parole. Police in riot gear stood between the competing groups, their presence a surreal reminder that not all officers were like Rusk, but enough were that people no longer trusted the uniform. Kiara stood with the other survivors at the top of the courthouse steps, and this time when reporters called out questions, they answered together, a unified front of people who'd transformed their pain into power. Vanessa spoke about finally feeling safe. Amara talked about vindication after 5 years of being dismissed. Derek described the relief of knowing Russ couldn't hurt anyone else. And when they finished, they turned and walked down the steps together, past the cameras and the protesters and the police, and climbed into waiting cars. The hardest work began the following week. The Police Accountability and Transparency Act had passed. Rusk had been convicted and sentenced, but those victories meant nothing without implementation. And implementation, Kiara was learning, was where good intentions went to die. 3 police departments in conservative districts had filed lawsuits challenging the law's constitutionality. The police union was organizing a ballot initiative to repeal key provisions. Several municipalities had simply refused to establish civilian review boards, betting that the state didn't have the resources to force compliance. Kiara threw herself into the fight with the same intensity she'd brought to the trial. She testified before county commissions, arguing for local implementation of state mandates. She met with police chiefs who were genuinely trying to reform their departments, helping them navigate the new requirements. She spoke at community forums, explaining how the review boards would work and why they were necessary. And slowly, grudgingly, the system began to change. The first civilian review board was established in the capital city in late April, 15 ordinary citizens given real authority to investigate complaints against police. The first case they reviewed was an excessive force allegation that Internal Affairs had previously dismissed as unfounded. The review board found otherwise, and the officer involved was suspended pending further investigation. It was a small victory, but it mattered. It showed that civilian oversight could work, that ordinary people could be trusted to evaluate police conduct fairly. Other jurisdictions began following suit, some enthusiastically, and others only after the Attorney General threatened legal action. By June, 12 review boards were operational across the state. Use of force reports were being published monthly on a public database, allowing journalists and researchers to identify patterns. Officers with sustained complaints were being flagged in a statewide tracking system, preventing them from simply moving to different departments when they were fired. The culture was changing too. Officer Maria Delgado became the public face of reform-minded police, speaking at academies and conferences about why good cops should welcome accountability. Other officers followed her lead, forming groups like Law Enforcement Leaders for Justice that advocated for reforms from within the profession. There was backlash, of course, always backlash. Some officers resigned rather than accept the new oversight. Some communities pushed back, worried about crime rates and response times. Conservative media outlets ran endless segments about the war on police and the collapse of law and order. But the crime rates didn't spike. Response times didn't increase. And slowly, as the sky failed to fall, the narrative began to shift. Polls showed increasing public support for police reform. Even some conservative legislators quietly admitted that the law was working better than they'd expected. Kiara watched these changes with cautious optimism. She knew how fragile progress was, how easily gains could be rolled back if people stopped paying attention. But she also saw something she hadn't seen before: momentum. The conversation had fundamentally changed. Accountability was no longer a radical idea, it was expected. In September, 9 months after the party that changed everything, Kiara stood at a podium in the state capitol for the signing of the Police Accountability Enhancement Act, a follow-up bill that expanded on the original reforms. It required mandatory de-escalation training, banned chokeholds except in life-threatening situations, and established a fund to compensate victims of police misconduct whose complaints had been previously dismissed. Governor Reed signed the bill surrounded by survivors, reform advocates, and progressive police chiefs. When she set down the pen, she turned to Kiara and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "None of this would have happened without your courage. Thank you for refusing to stay silent." The applause was thunderous. Kiara accepted hugs from Vanessa, Amara, Derek, and dozens of others who'd become her friends and allies through this journey. She shook hands with Officer Delgado and Sergeant Mason, thanking them for their bravery in speaking up. She fielded questions from reporters about what came next. And when it was finally over, when the cameras were turned off and the crowd had dispersed, Kiara walked alone through the Capitol building's marble halls, and let herself feel the full weight of what they'd accomplished. They hadn't fixed everything. Police brutality still existed. Racism and bias still infected law enforcement. There were still bad officers who'd never face consequences. Still victims who'd never get justice. Still communities terrorized by the people sworn to protect them. But something had shifted. The system that had seemed immovable had moved. The walls that had seemed impenetrable had cracked. And in those cracks, light was finally beginning to shine through. Kiara graduated that December, 4 months later than originally planned, but with honors despite everything. Her mother attended the ceremony, beaming with pride as Kiara walked across the stage to receive her diploma in sociology and political science. Tasha screamed so loudly when Kiara's name was called that several professors glared at her, but Tasha just grinned and kept cheering. At the reception afterward, Kiara was surrounded by friends and family, but she found herself thinking about the other survivors. Vanessa had started working at the Victim Advocacy Center, helping other survivors navigate the criminal justice system. Amara had been hired by a progressive police department to redesign their use of force training. Derek had become a public speaker, sharing his story at schools and community centers. They'd all transformed their trauma into purpose. They'd all refused to let what happened define them, even as they used it to create change. And together they'd proven that the system could be forced to bend, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but genuinely, toward justice. That night, Kiara sat in her childhood bedroom one last time before moving into her own apartment, scrolling through news coverage of the year that had passed. She saw Rusk's mugshot in article after article, his story now a cautionary tale taught in police academies and law school classes. She saw photos of herself at rallies and hearings and press conferences. This version of herself she barely recognized, confident, articulate, unafraid. She thought about the girl in the green dress, the one who'd just wanted one normal night. That girl was gone. Not destroyed exactly, but transformed into someone stronger and sadder and more aware of how the world really worked. Someone who understood that justice wasn't a destination, but a direction, and that maintaining it required constant, exhausting vigilance. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Proud of you doesn't even begin to cover it. You changed the world, baby. Never forget that." Kiara smiled, typed back a heart emoji, and then opened her laptop. She had applications to fill out, graduate programs in public policy, advocacy organizations looking for new staff, foundations offering fellowships to emerging leaders in criminal justice reform. There was still so much work to do, so many battles left to fight, so many survivors who needed someone to stand with them, just as people had stood with her. But for the first time since that November night, Kiara felt ready. Not just ready to survive, but ready to lead. Ready to use everything she'd learned and suffered and overcome to make sure the system that had failed so many people for so long finally became what it was supposed to be. A mechanism for justice, not a shield for violence. She thought about Officer Rusk in his prison cell, about the 17 complaints that had been ignored, about the countless others whose abuse had never been documented at all. She thought about the new review boards and tracking systems and transparency requirements that would make it harder for the next Rusk to hide. And she thought about a future where maybe, just maybe, no one else would have to experience what she'd experienced, where a young woman could stand up to power without fearing for her life, where complaints were actually investigated, where accountability wasn't exceptional but expected. That future wasn't here yet, but it was closer than it had been, and Kiara was going to spend the rest of her life helping to build it. She closed her laptop, turned off the light, and lay in the darkness thinking about tomorrow, about the apartment she'd move into, the job she'd start, the life she'd continue building brick by brick. She thought about the scars she'd carry forever, visible and invisible, and about the strength those scars represented. The girl who'd been choked at a party could have become a victim and nothing more. Instead, she'd become a force, and that force had moved mountains. Kiara smiled in the darkness and let herself believe in the possibility of a world where violence didn't go unchallenged, where courage was contagious, where justice wasn't just for the powerful, but for everyone. It was possible. She'd proven it was possible. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was enough to keep fighting for. The slap that had echoed through a party 9 months ago had sent ripples that were still spreading, through police departments and courtrooms and legislative chambers, through communities and conversations and the collective conscience of a state that had decided enough was enough. Officer Nolan Rusk had believed he was untouchable. He'd been wrong. And every officer who thought they could follow in his footsteps now knew they were wrong too, because Kiara Reed and the survivors who'd stood with her had changed the rules. They'd rewritten the story of what happened when ordinary people faced extraordinary injustice. They'd proven that power could be challenged, that systems could be reformed, and that courage, real courage, could light fires that burned away decades of rot. The work would never be finished. There would always be another fight, another injustice, another person who needed someone to stand with them. But tonight, Kiara Reed, survivor, advocate, force for change, allowed herself to rest. She'd earned it. They all had. And tomorrow, the work would continue. Because that's what justice required. Not a single dramatic victory, but 1,000 small ones, strung together day after day until the world finally looked like what it should have been all along. A world where everyone, regardless of who their mother was, could expect to be treated with dignity, where accountability wasn't radical but routine, where the badge meant protection, not threat. They weren't there yet, but they were closer, and that was worth everything.